The wind in this part of Montana Territory did not ask permission. It simply arrived, a high lonesome sound that scoured the plains and rattled the one window frame in Nathaniel Reed's cabin. It was the only constant companion he had, and he had come to measure his days by its howl. This was the spring of 1883, and the land was just beginning to thaw, the threat of a late frost clinging to the air like a bitter memory. Nathaniel's ranch was not much of a ranch. Not yet. It was 160 acres of hard-won privacy at the very edge of Silverdale's sphere of influence. He had the cabin, which he had built with his own hands. The logs chinked tight against that very wind. He had a sturdy barn that housed his 2 draft horses, a milk cow, and a handful of half-wild longhorns he was trying to gentle. And he had the garden plot, fenced against rabbits, where the pale green shoots of onions and potatoes were just now pushing their way toward the sun. It was a life of sweat and silence. He stood by that garden now, his hands resting on the worn handle of his hoe. He was a man built like the land itself, broad and quiet. His shoulders stooped slightly from labor, not from weakness. His face was weathered by sun and wind, making him look older than his 34 years. He was, by nature, a practical man. He fixed what was broken, he planted what he needed, and he did not speak on matters that did not concern him. He respected his neighbors by keeping his distance, and he expected the same. But respect could not fill the echoing quiet of the cabin. It could not mend the torn calico curtain that hung crookedly over the window, a relic left by the previous homesteader who had given up. It could not turn the hard, dense loaf of sourdough he baked every 4th day into something soft and welcoming. The loneliness had become a physical ache, a cold spot in his gut that even a hot cup of black coffee could not reach. It was that ache that had made him do it. 6 months ago, in the dead of winter when the wind screamed for a week straight, he had ridden into Silverdale. He had gone to the telegraph office, his hands sweating inside his gloves, and sent a message east. After that, letters had been exchanged. Slow and careful, he had sent money for the agency fee. He had described his property with blunt honesty, omitting nothing of its harshness. He had answered questions about his character by getting a letter from the preacher in Silverdale, though Nathaniel rarely attended services. And then, a week ago, he had received the last letter. He carried it in his shirt pocket, where it crackled against his ribs. He knew its contents by heart, but it was the smell of it that kept him touching it. The paper, thin and fine, smelled faintly of lavender. It was a scent that had no place in his world of pine, horsehide, and wood smoke. It was a smell of hope, and it terrified him. The letter stated that his intended, a Miss Zoe Caldwell, had accepted his proposal of correspondence and passage. She would be arriving today. He had marked the days by scratching lines into the cabin door frame, like a prisoner. This morning, he had scratched the last one. The stage from Helena was due in the afternoon. 3 days, the final letter had said, but that had been last week. Today was the 3rd day. He had spent those 3 days in a fog of clumsy preparation. He had scrubbed the cabin floor with lye soap until his knuckles were raw. He had beaten the dust from his one good quilt. He had even attempted to fix the torn curtain, but his thick, calloused fingers had only made the rip worse. And he had finally pulled the thing down, leaving the window bare. He had bought a small sack of candy from Mr. Jenkins at the general store, and now it sat in a tin on the table, looking foolish and out of place. His internal conflict was a constant, low hum beneath his ribs. He was a plain man, a rancher with dirt under his nails and a patch on his overalls. What right did he have to expect a woman, especially one from the East, to share this life? He feared rejection, the look in her eyes when she saw the raw emptiness of the place, the way the wind never stopped talking. He was afraid of being seen as a man who had to buy a wife, a man so lacking that he could not win one in the ordinary way. He spat into the dust. There was no ordinary way out here. Not for him. He looked toward the barn. The sun was past its peak. If he was going, he had to go now. He saddled his mare, Bess, choosing her over the wagon. It felt more personal, less like he was hauling freight. He checked his appearance in the sliver of mirror he kept by the wash basin. The glass was cracked, splitting his face in two. He saw a man with worried eyes and hair that was too long. He had forgotten to cut it. There was no time now. The ride to Silverdale took the better part of an hour. The town was just one dusty main street carved between low wooden buildings. There was the general store, the saloon, the church, and the stage line office, which was run by Frank Wilson. Frank was outside, sweeping the boardwalk with a kind of lazy determination. He was a man who saw everything and said most of it. He nodded as Nathaniel tied Bess to the rail. "Reed," Frank said, leaning on his broom. "Are you expecting freight?" "Expecting a passenger," Nathaniel said, his voice sounding rusty to his own ears. He cleared his throat. Frank Wilson's eyebrows lifted. He stopped sweeping. "A passenger. Well now, not many folks come to Silverdale proper. Most are passing through to the goldfields up north." Nathaniel just nodded, his jaw tight. He hated the scrutiny. He could already feel the eyes of the town, the invisible network of gossip that connected Mr. Jenkins in his store to the men drinking early in the saloon. He was a private man being forced into a public spectacle. "Should be here inside the hour," Frank said, his curiosity barely masked. "If the creek ain't running too high at Miller's Crossing." Nathaniel turned away, pretending to check Bess's cinch. He felt the need to fill the silence, to justify himself. "I am just here to meet the stage. That is all." Sure, Frank said, returning to his sweeping. But his movements were energized now. He had news. Nathaniel walked down the street to Jenkins's General Mercantile. The bell over the door tinkled. The store smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and new denim. Mr. Jenkins, a small man with a neat apron, was weighing out flour for one of the few women in town. Nathaniel respectfully removed his hat. The woman nodded stiffly at him. He knew her from church socials, though he had never spoken to her. "Afternoon, Mr. Reed," Jenkins said, his voice cheerful. "What can we do for you, more beans, kerosene?" "I need some tea," Nathaniel said. He had just remembered. Women drank tea. He drank coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Tea it is. We got the good black from China, or some herbal mixes." "The black," Nathaniel said. He pointed. "And perhaps one of those biscuits in the jar." Jenkins bagged the items, his eyes bright with the same curiosity Frank Wilson had shown. "Heard you was meeting the stage. Frank Wilson mentioned you were expecting someone." So it had already spread. In less than 5 minutes. "I am," Nathaniel said, paying the man. He felt the woman's gaze sharp on his back. He was being weighed and measured. A clodhopper rancher, playing at being a gentleman. He took his small parcels and escaped back into the relative anonymity of the dusty street. He did not want to be here. He wanted to be on his own land, where the only judgment came from the sky and the soil. He retreated to the bench outside the stage office, sitting stiffly, his hat pulled low. He was a man waiting for a verdict. This was the dark side of the frontier. Out here, the law was thin, represented by a sheriff who was often miles away. The community was built on the twin pillars of the church and the saloon, and both ran on gossip. A man's reputation was everything, and his was that of a loner, a man who kept to himself. Now he was willingly inviting a stranger not just into his home, but into his life. A woman who, by the very nature of her arrival, was vulnerable. He thought about the core of his agreement with the agency. He had promised a safe home, respect, and provision. He had not, in his letters, spoken of love. That felt like a lie, a word too big and fragile for a place like this. He had spoken of partnership. He hoped that would be enough. He hoped he would be enough. The silence of his wait was broken by the distant sound of the horn. Frank Wilson came bustling out of the office. "She's coming up the rise." Nathaniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood up, wiping his sweaty palms on his overalls. This was it. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust, stinging his eyes. He saw the coach, a lumbering red beast pulled by 4 tired horses, rocking and swaying as it approached. It slowed, the driver hauling on the reins with a loud "Whoa!" Frank Wilson moved to open the door. Nathaniel just stood there, rooted to the boardwalk, his breath caught in his chest. He had dreaded this moment. He had feared being rejected. He had feared the town's laughter. But as he stood there, watching the dust settle, a new feeling pushed through the fear. It was not excitement. It was a grim, protective resolve. He did not know the woman who was about to step out of that coach. He did not know her story or her burdens. But he had given his word. He had brought her here, to this harsh land, far from everything she knew. The thought solidified in his mind, clear and simple, cutting through his own self-doubt. Whatever else happened, he would be a man of his word. Her safety came first, before his pride, before his loneliness, before anything. He took a step forward as the coach door creaked open. He held his breath, waiting. He had spent the last 3 days wondering what she would look like. He had spent the last hour consumed with what she would think of him. Now, none of it mattered. He saw a boot, small and worn, feel for the step. Nathaniel Reed moved out of the shadow of the overhang and into the harsh afternoon sun. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands, and waited for his life to change. The boot that appeared in the doorway was small, its leather scuffed and worn thin at the toe. It hesitated, poised above the metal step, before descending. Nathaniel Reed felt his entire body go rigid. His hat was clutched in both hands, the brim suffering under the grip of his knuckles. A woman emerged, backing out slowly. She was dressed in dark, heavy traveling clothes that seemed to swallow her small frame. She held a single, worn carpet bag in one hand. When she turned, her face was obscured by a thick, dark green veil. The stage driver, a big man with a dusty beard, grunted as he tossed a few mailbags down to Frank Wilson. Frank, however, was not looking at the mail. His gaze was fixed on the woman. Nathaniel felt the eyes of Silverdale, a physical pressure from the windows of the Mercantile and the shaded doorway of the saloon. The whole town, all dozen of them who were out, seemed to be holding its breath. This was his doing. This silent, veiled figure in the harsh Montana sun was his responsibility. He took a step forward, his boots scraping the boardwalk. "Miss Caldwell." His voice was too loud, rougher than he had intended. The woman flinched, a movement so sharp it looked like she had been struck. She did not turn her head, but he saw her hand, covered in a mended glove, tighten on the handle of her bag. She gave a single, jerking nod. He was supposed to say something. "Welcome. I am glad you are here." The journey was long, but the words were locked in his throat. He felt the judgment of Frank Wilson, the barely concealed curiosity. He was a plain man, and this felt like a performance he did not know how to give. Zoe Caldwell stood frozen for a long second. Then, her free hand rose, the fingers trembling. She reached for the edge of the veil. Nathaniel had a sudden, absurd urge to tell her to stop, to leave it down. She lifted it. The gasp was audible. It came from Frank Wilson. Nathaniel felt his own stomach clench, a cold sickness rising. Her face was a ruin, a deep, sickening bruise, yellow at the edges and a dark, angry purple, spread from her cheekbone nearly to her eye. Her bottom lip was split, the cut scabbed over and dark. She was pale beneath the injury, so pale she looked translucent, and her eyes, they were wide with a terror so profound it stole his breath. She looked like a rabbit caught in a trap, waiting for the boot to fall. All his anxieties about his rough hands, his small cabin, his own unworthiness, evaporated. They were replaced by a sudden, cold fury that settled deep in his chest. It was an anger so pure and clean it almost felt peaceful. It was not directed at her. It was directed at the world that had done this. He saw her watching him, her gaze flitting from his face to the horse, to the town, searching for the first sign of rejection, the first hint of disgust that would send her back. She was bracing for it. She did not speak. Instead, her hand fumbled at the small reticule tied to her wrist. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, a crisp white envelope that was starkly clean against her dusty clothes. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold it out to him. He took it. It was not one of the lavender-scented letters. It was thick, sealed with the embossed stamp of the Western Bride Agency. He broke the seal. He unfolded the paper. Frank Wilson took a step closer, pretending to inspect a wheel on the coach. Nathaniel turned his shoulder, shielding the letter from view. The writing was concise. Mr. Reed, the circumstances of this arrangement have altered significantly. Miss Caldwell is not in a position to fulfill the immediate expectations of a marriage contract. She requires sanctuary. She requires safety more than she requires a husband. You are, by this letter, fully released from any and all obligations, financial or personal. You may cancel this arrangement without penalty. We trust your discretion. He read it twice. She requires safety. He looked up from the letter. He looked at the bruise. He looked at her eyes, which were now swimming with a desperate, unshed panic. She knew what the letter said. She was waiting for the verdict. He saw Frank Wilson's impatient curiosity. He saw the woman in the mercantile window. He felt the town pressing in, ready to judge this broken piece of humanity he had ordered like freight. Nathaniel Reed folded the letter. He did it slowly, deliberately, making each crease sharp. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, the same pocket that had held the lavender letter. He met her terrified gaze. He did not smile. This was no time for false comfort. He spoke, and his voice was low, but it carried in the dry air, firm as the mountains behind him. You're not alone now. Zoe Caldwell's eyes widened further, if that was possible. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her unbruised cheek before she swiped it away with a desperate, gloved hand. He nodded. A single, sharp motion. "Frank, her trunk!" Frank Wilson snapped out of his stupor. "Right. Reed, trunk, heavy one." "It can follow," Nathaniel said. He did not want her standing on this street, this stage, for 1 second longer. He gently took the carpetbag from her hand. Her fingers released it with a reluctance, as if it were her last anchor. "Ma'am," he said, gesturing to Bess, "my horse is here." She looked at the mare, then at him. He had not brought the wagon. He had been a fool, thinking of himself, not of her comfort. Now she would have to ride, and he would have to lift her. He saw the realization dawn on her, and with it, a fresh wave of fear. "I will have to lift you," he said. He made it a statement of fact, not an offer. She flinched again, a small, tight motion of her shoulders, but she nodded. She turned to the horse, her back rigid. Nathaniel was acutely aware of the eyes on his back. He put his hands on her waist. He was deliberate, his touch firm but impersonal, grabbing the solid part of her corset, not the softness of her. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her easily, settling her sideways onto the saddle. He stepped back immediately, giving her space. He did not get on behind her. He untied Bess's reins from the hitching post. He gave a curt nod to Frank Wilson, who was now wrestling with a large, battered trunk. Nathaniel did not look at anyone else. He began to walk, leading the mare by the bridle. They moved down the main street of Silverdale. It was a long, slow procession. Nathaniel kept his eyes forward. He heard a low whistle from the saloon porch, but he did not turn. He just kept walking, his steps even, his back straight. He was acutely aware of the woman perched on his saddle, her veil now lowered, hiding her face from the world once more. The dust of the town fell away, replaced by the smell of sagebrush and the rising sound of the wind. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the plod of his boots and the clop of Bess's hooves. He walked for nearly 10 minutes before he allowed himself to glance back. She was clutching the saddle horn with both hands, her head bowed. She looked less like a woman and more like a child, lost and abandoned. That cold anger returned, simmering beneath his ribs. Someone, somewhere, had done this. Some man, he was sure, a guardian, perhaps. The letters had mentioned a guardian in Boston who had approved the arrangement, eager to have her settled, eager to be rid of her. It seemed. His promise echoed in his own mind. "You're not alone now?" It had been an instinct, a wall he had thrown up against Frank Wilson's prying eyes and her bottomless terror. Now, in the quiet of the high plains, the words felt heavy. They felt like a vow, more binding than any paper he could have signed at the courthouse. Zoe felt the sway of the horse, a rhythm that was pulling her deeper into exhaustion. Every jolt sent a dull ache through her cheek. She was terrified. She was a fraud. She had arrived as damaged goods. And the man, this Mr. Reed, had been given an escape. He had read the letter. She had seen his face. He was a hard man, like the land itself. But he had not sent her back. "You're not alone now." What did it mean? Was it a different kind of ownership, a debt she now owed? She was bracing for the moment he would demand payment. Men always demanded payment. Her uncle, her guardian, had demanded it every day. She had to be useful. She had to cook, to clean, to serve. She could not be a burden. I can work, Mr. Reed," she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak, and the movement of her split lips sent a sharp pain through her jaw. Nathaniel stopped. Bess stopped with him. He turned, looking up at her. His eyes were gray, clear, and unreadable. "We will talk at the cabin," he said. "Rest now." He turned and started walking again. When the homestead came into view, Zoe felt a fresh drop of despair. The cabin was tiny, isolated in a vast, empty bowl of land. There was a barn, but nothing else. No other houses, no neighbors, no escape. She was entirely at his mercy. He led Bess right up to the small porch. "We are here." He stood beside the horse, his hands at his sides. He was waiting for her to ask, or perhaps to move. She did not know how. She could not just slide off. "I will help you down," he said, his voice flat. She braced herself. He reached up, his hands finding her waist again. The touch was just as brief, just as functional as before. He lifted her, set her feet on the wooden planks of the porch, and stepped back. He did not let his hands linger. He did not try to steady her, though she was swaying from stiffness and fatigue. He simply gave her the space he had stepped out of. He went to the door, which was just raw, planed wood, and pushed it open. He stood aside. "After you, ma'am." She hesitated on the threshold. She looked inside. The cabin was one room. It was starkly clean, but painfully bare. There was a table with one chair, a cast-iron stove, shelves with tins and sacks, and in the far corner, a bed, one bed. Her blood ran cold. This was it. This was the trap. Nathaniel saw her gaze lock onto the bed frame. He saw the panic that had momentarily subsided rush back into her face, draining it of what little color it had. He knew what she was seeing. He stepped past her, into the room, placing her bag on the table. He did not look at her. He looked at the bed. "That is my bed," he said, his voice rough. "I will be sleeping in the barn. I have a clean cot there." Zoe's head snapped up. She stared at his back. He was a broad man, filling the small space. He pointed to a curtained-off alcove, the one where the torn calico had been. "That is a small room. It was for storage. I can have it cleared out by nightfall. Or you can have this main room. The cabin. The choice is yours. You will have your own door, your own space." She was trembling again, but this time it was from confusion. This kindness was disorienting. It made no sense. "But, Mr. Reed," she stammered, twisting her gloved hands together. "I must..." I must earn my keep. I'm a hard worker. I can cook. I can mend. The agency, the agreement. The agreement is changed, he said, turning to face her. His expression was not kind, not soft, but it was steady. You earn nothing here. Ma'am, you are here to be safe. That is what the letter said. That is what I agreed to when I brought you from town. The papers, she whispered. The last terrible weight. The preacher, the marriage. There are no papers, he said. I did not stop at the courthouse. I will not sign any papers, ma'am, until you ask me to. If you ever ask me to, your safety comes first. It was too much. The long journey, the fear, the pain, and now this baffling, terrifying gentleness. The room tilted. She put a hand out, grabbing the door frame to steady herself. Nathaniel moved faster than she would have thought possible. He did not reach for her. He grabbed the single chair and slid it behind her. Sit, he commanded. Her legs obeyed. She sank into the chair, her body shaking. He was already at the water bucket, dipping a ladle. He brought it to her, holding it steady. He was careful, handing it to her so that their fingers did not touch. She drank, the water cool and slightly metallic. It cleared some of the fog from her head. He stood by the stove, his back to her, giving her the illusion of privacy. You rest, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I will go fetch your trunk. I will be back before dark. He picked up his hat, which he had placed on the table, and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. Zoe sat alone in the silent cabin. She listened to the sound of the wind, the high, lonesome sound he must live with every day. She looked at the bruises on her own hands as she pulled off her gloves. You're not alone now. For the first time in her life. She wondered if that could be true. The promise hung in the air, echoing in the empty room, both a comfort and a terrifying new burden. He had offered her safety, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that safety was never, ever free. Zoe sat frozen in the chair for a very long time after he left. The sound of the door closing, soft as it was, seemed to echo in the room. She was alone, truly alone, in a strange cabin, with a man she did not know, in a territory that felt like the surface of the moon. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the high, thin cry of the wind and the steady ticking of a small mantel clock. It was a masculine silence, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of the water he had given her. She looked at the bed in the corner, his bed. It was neatly made, covered by a thick wool blanket, but the pillow held the faint impression of his head. The sight of it made her stomach clench. He had said he would sleep in the barn. She did not believe him. Men lied. They lied with soft voices and they lied with raised fists. Kindness was just a different kind of trap, a way to make you lower your guard before the real price was exacted. Her uncle had been kind, at first, but her body was screaming with exhaustion. She had not slept, truly slept, in days, perhaps weeks. The rocking of the coach, the constant fear, the sharp pain in her face. It had all blurred into one long nightmare. She stood on trembling legs. She had to see. She walked to the curtained alcove he had pointed out. It was not a room. Not really. It was a deep storage space, perhaps 8 feet square, with no window. It was filled with the things a man on his own might store sacks of flour and beans piled high, some steel traps hanging from a peg, a disassembled wagon wheel, and coils of rope. But it was separate. The curtain, a heavy piece of canvas, gave it privacy. She touched one of the flour sacks. He was a man who planned. He had provisions. He was not destitute. This was a small, practical comfort. She returned to the chair and waited. She waited for the sun to lower, painting the bare window with shades of orange and purple. She waited for the room to grow cold, and she waited for the sound of his return. It came just as the light was failing, the sound of a wagon, the jingle of harness, and the soft woe of his voice. Her heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the arms of the chair. He had the wagon now. He was bringing the trunk. His boots sounded on the porch, a heavy thump as he set something down. Then a knock. It was a quiet, hesitant knock, not the sound of a man entering his own home. She could not find her voice. "Miss Caldwell," he called through the wood. "I have your trunk." Come in," she managed to say, her voice a dry whisper. He opened the door. He was a large man, and he seemed to fill the entire doorway, blocking out the last of the light. He was carrying his saddlebags and the small parcels of tea and biscuits from the mercantile. He placed them on the table. "I will fetch the trunk," he said. He did not look at her, but instead at the alcove. "Where would you like it?" In there, please," she said, pointing. He nodded once. He went back outside. She heard him grunt with effort, a low sound, and then the scrape of the heavy trunk being dragged across the porch. He appeared in the doorway again, dragging it. He was immensely strong. He did not ask for her help. He simply angled the large trunk through the door, his muscles straining against his shirt. Instead of just leaving it in the middle of the room, he maneuvered it all the way to the storage alcove and pushed it inside. Then he stopped. He looked at the piled sacks, the traps, the wheel. He looked at the trunk, which took up half the remaining floor space. He looked at her. "This will not do," he said, more to himself than to her. He disappeared back outside. She heard him in the barn, the sound of movement, of things being shifted. He returned a few minutes later with an empty grain barrel, which he rolled into the corner. "I will move these supplies to the barn," he said. He did not ask. He stated. For the next half hour, he worked. He loaded the sacks of flour and beans onto his shoulders and carried them, one by one, to the barn. He took the traps, the rope, the wagon wheel. He worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm, never pausing, never complaining. He was simply making space. When the alcove was empty, save for her trunk, it felt almost like a room. It was bare wood, floor to ceiling, but it was hers. He returned from the barn carrying a narrow cot, folded. He opened it and set it against the far wall. On top of it, he placed a thick mattress ticking and a clean, folded quilt. It was the good one, the one she had seen on his own bed. He must have taken it while he was in the barn. "This is yours," he said. He stood in the doorway of the small room, not entering it. "It is not much, but the barn is warm, and I have a cot there for myself." She stared at the cot. He was giving her his best quilt. I cannot," she whispered. "Mr. Reed, that is yours." "It is yours," he repeated, his voice firm. "You are my guest." He left the alcove and went to the stove. He began to build a fire, splitting kindling with a small hatchet, the movements economical and precise. The smell of pine filled the room. Zoe felt a wave of shame. He was doing all the work. He was the host, and she was the burden. Her uncle's voice echoed in her head. Useless, a worthless mouth to feed. "I must cook," she said, standing up. The movement was too fast. Nathaniel turned, the hatchet in his hand. He did not raise it, but he stilled. Zoe froze, her hand flying to her throat, a small sound of fear escaping her. He saw the terror in her eyes. He immediately set the hatchet down, very slowly, and stepped back from the stove. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low. "I did not mean to startle you." "No, it was... she stammered, angry at her own reaction. "I must prepare the supper. I can cook. I am a very good cook." He looked at the stove, then at the parcels on the table. "I bought tea. I do not know how to brew it." This was something she understood. A task. She moved to the table, her hands shaking, but her instincts taking over. She unwrapped the tea. "Do you have a pot?" He pointed to a small kettle. She set about the rituals of making tea, of finding the flour bin, of seeing what provisions he had. It was a relief to move, to have a purpose, to let her hands do the thinking her mind could not. He did not try to help. He sat at the table, on a small, three-legged stool he had brought from the hearth. He had left the only chair for her. He watched her, but not in the way her uncle had, not with a critical or assessing gaze. He just watched, quietly. They worked in silence. She made biscuits, her movements becoming more confident. He sliced thick bacon and put it in a heavy skillet. The cabin began to fill with the smells of baking bread, sizzling meat, and the strange, sharp scent of the black tea. When the food was ready, they sat at the small table. She took the chair. He took the stool. The oil lamp cast a small, warm circle of light, leaving the corners of the cabin in deep shadow. The silence was deafening. Zoe did not know the rules. Was she supposed to talk? She cut her biscuit, her eyes down. The tea is good, Nathaniel said finally, his voice rough. Thank you, she whispered. You can hear the creek, he said, gesturing toward the dark window. It is not far. The water is cold all year. Good for the milk cow. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He wanted to ask. The questions were burning in his throat. Who did this to you? What is your uncle's name? Why did you run? But he had promised her safety, and safety meant an absence of pressure. It meant not demanding her story as payment for the food he gave her. He was protecting her, but he was learning that to truly protect, he could not possess. He could not even possess her history. So he ate his bacon and biscuits, and he drank the strange, bitter tea she had made. When the meal was done, she stood to clear the plates. Sit, he said. It was not a harsh command, but it was firm. I will clean. You are tired from your journey. She sat. He moved to the wash basin, pouring hot water from the kettle, washing the few dishes with a clumsy thoroughness. Zoe watched his back. He was a man of contradictions. He was hard and calloused, yet he had given her his chair and his quilt. He was silent, yet he had spoken the only words that mattered at the stage depot. He was fighting his own desires, the simple human need for companionship, because he had made a promise of safety. When he was finished, he dried his hands on a rough towel. He picked up the blanket he had left by the door, the one that was not the good quilt. He paused, his hand on the door latch. Ma'am, he said, still not looking at her. Your room, the alcove. I do not have a proper door for it. Just the canvas. It is fine, she said. No, he said. He thought for a moment. Tomorrow, I will build a door. For tonight. He looked at her, his gaze direct, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. I will sleep in the barn. I am a heavy sleeper. He turned to the main cabin door. I do not lock this. I never lock it. There is no one out here. He hesitated, trying to find the words. I want you to know that. You are not locked in. You are free. Zoe's breath caught. He was offering her an escape route. He was telling her she was not a prisoner. Good night, Miss Caldwell, he said. He opened the door and slipped out into the darkness, closing it softly behind him. She was alone again, but the silence felt different. It was filled with the warmth of the stove and the lingering smell of biscuits. She retreated to the small alcove. Her trunk was there, a solid link to her past, and the cot was there, a symbol of her strange, uncertain future. She touched the good quilt. It was soft. She pulled the heavy canvas curtain shut. It blocked the main room, creating a tiny, dark space that was entirely her own. She sat on the cot. She did not sleep. She could not. The wind howled, and every scrape of a branch, every creak of the cabin walls, sent a jolt of panic through her. The shadow of her uncle was long. It had followed her all the way from Boston. She saw his face in the dark, heard his voice whispering that she was ungrateful, that she was his property. She fought the urge to pile her trunk against the curtain, She thought of the town, of the whispers. Mail-order bride, they would all be talking. That poor rancher, buying a wife. And look what arrived, damaged goods. She felt the sting of their pity, their curiosity. But then she thought of Nathaniel. He was sleeping in the barn, on a cot, in the cold. He had given her his chair, his quilt, his food. And he had asked for nothing, not a single thing. He had not even asked her name. Though he knew it, he had not asked about her face. He had promised her safety. Dawn came, gray and cold, filtering through the main cabin window. Zoe had not slept. She heard him long before she saw him, the steady, rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. She rose, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to smooth her hair. She could not be a burden. She would work, she would earn her place, whether he wanted her to or not. She pushed back the canvas curtain. He was at the stove, his back to her, adding the wood he had just cut. Coffee was already boiling, filling the air with a rich, dark smell. He heard her and turned. He nodded. "Ma'am, I hope you rested." "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice stiff. I must thank you for your hospitality, but I cannot accept this. You have paid for a wife. I will be your wife. I will cook, and I will clean, and I will, No, he said. It was not loud, but it stopped her cold. He turned from the stove to face her. His eyes were clear, and they held no pity. They held a kind of frustrating, resolute honor. "I told you, Miss Caldwell, the agreement has changed." "But the papers," she insisted, a note of desperation in her voice. "We must go to the preacher, to make it right. The town, they—" "I did not sign any papers," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. She stared at him. "What?" "When I was in town, I saw you. I read the letter from the agency." He looked down at his own hands, then back at her. "I did not go to the courthouse. I did not speak to the preacher. There are no papers. There is no marriage." Zoe felt the floor shift beneath her. "But you paid—" "That money is gone. It does not matter," he said. "I will not. I cannot sign a paper that binds a woman who is not free to choose. To do so, especially now, it would be a kind of theft. It would not be right." He looked at her, and his gaze was steady. "You are not my wife, Miss Caldwell. You are my guest. You will stay here. You will heal. And you will decide what comes next. If you wish to leave, I will pay your passage. If you wish to stay, we will speak of it then. But the choice," he said, and his voice was absolute, "is yours." She could not speak. He had given her back her life. He had handed her a power she had forgotten she ever possessed, the power to say no. She looked at this rough man, in his rough cabin, and felt the first, tiny, agonizing thaw of a belief she thought had died. She wrapped her arms around herself. She whispered, and the words were so small he barely heard them. "I will try. I will try to trust." He nodded once, as if she had just told him the weather. He turned back to the stove. "I will make the coffee," he said. "The tea it is still strange to me." The first thing Nathaniel Reed did the next morning was build the door. Zoe heard him from her cot, the sound of sawing, then steady, rhythmic hammering. He did not ask. He did not consult her. He simply did what he had said he would do. She rose, dressed in the faint light, and pushed back the canvas curtain. He had set up 2 sawhorses outside the cabin. He was planning the edges of several thick boards, his movements long and sure. He was a man who understood wood. He knew how to make it fit. He worked for hours, stopping only to tend to his stock. He did not seem to require rest. Zoe, meanwhile, felt the old, familiar panic of uselessness. She could not just sit and watch him build her a shelter inside his own. She went to the stove. She found his coffee, but also the tea he had bought for her. She made a pot of tea, the ritual settling her nerves. She found his bin of flour, the lard, the salt. She made biscuits, her hands remembering the motions her mind had nearly lost to fear. When he finally stopped his work, the sun was high. He came inside, brushing sawdust from his arms. He saw the plate of biscuits. He saw the tin cup of tea she had poured for him. He looked at them, then at her. I cannot be idle. Mr. Reed, she said, her hands twisting in the folds of her skirt. I must contribute. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. He seemed to understand that her need to work was as deep as his. It was a kind of anchor. That is fair, he said. He picked up a biscuit. It was light, flaky, nothing like his own dense bread. He ate it in 2 bites. These are fine biscuits. He drank the tea. He made a small face at its bitterness, but finished the cup. After their silent meal, he returned to his work. Late in the afternoon, he brought the door inside. It was heavy, made of solid pine. He had forged hinges in his small smithy, and a simple wooden latch. He hung it, testing its swing. It fit perfectly, closing with a soft thud. He showed her the latch. "This is for your side," he said. "There is no latch on my side, no key, only you can open it from in there." Zoe stared at the small, carved piece of wood. A latch on the inside. It was a lock she controlled. It was a statement more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It was the physical shape of his promise. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers tracing the smooth, new wood. "It will be cold," he said, gruffly, turning away. "I will need to chink it better before winter." With that, he took his blanket and went to the barn. Just as he had the night before, a rhythm began. It was a rhythm born of necessity and unspoken agreements. The days were measured by tasks. Nathaniel rose before the sun. His first sounds the splitting of wood and the low murmur of his voice to his horses. He spent his days in the fields, mending the long stretches of fence that his small herd of longhorns always seemed to be testing. He was extending the garden plot, digging up the tough prairie sod, turning it over to make way for more crops. He was a man in constant, powerful motion. Zoe claimed the cabin and the garden as her own. She could not bear the uselessness of the bare window, the single chair, the layer of dust that seemed to coat everything despite his scrubbing. She unpacked her trunk. In it, folded carefully, were the remnants of her old life, a few dresses, some books, and a small sewing box. She took the torn calico curtain he had discarded. Her fingers, deft and practiced, stitched the tear, reinforcing it. She washed it in the creek until the colors brightened. She hung it back in the main window. It was still patched, but it was whole. With a few yards of plain muslin from her trunk, she sewed a new, proper curtain for her own doorway. Replacing the heavy canvas, the small alcove began to feel less like a storage space and more like a room. She found a tin of wild raspberry preserves in his meager pantry and baked a small cobbler. The smell of sweet fruit and warm bread filled the cabin. When Nathaniel came in that evening, muddy and exhausted, he stopped just inside the door. He looked at the curtain. He smelled the cobbler. He saw that she had found a small tin and put a cluster of purple wildflowers on the table. The cabin. His stark, lonely box had begun to look like a home. He said nothing. He just washed his hands and sat at the table. Zoe served him. She was waiting for the criticism. Her uncle had always found fault: too much sugar, not enough salt. The wood was not stacked neatly. Nathaniel ate the entire cobbler. He looked at the empty dish. "I have not had a thing like that in many years," he said. It was good. The next day, she went to the garden plot. His seedlings were strong but choked with the first flush of spring weeds. Her hands went to work, pulling, thinning, tamping the earth around the small potato plants. He came up behind her, silent as he always was, and she startled, scrambling to her feet. He stopped, holding his hands up, palms out. "I am sorry. I did not mean to—" "No," she said, breathing hard, angry at her own fear. I was just weeding." He looked at the neat rows, at the small, careful piles of weeds. "You know this work." "Yes," she said, looking at her dirt-stained hands. "My mother and we had a large kitchen garden in Vermont." It was the first piece of her past she had offered. Nathaniel catalogued it. Vermont. Not Boston. That was where the skill came from. She was not a fragile city doll. She had roots in the soil. "You have a green thumb," he said. "They look better for it." He did not praise her. He praised the work. This she was beginning to understand. He respected effort. He respected skill. He did not lavish her with false flattery or comments on her person. He never, ever mentioned her face. The bruise was fading. The angry purple had become a sickly yellow, and now it was just a faint, greenish shadow under her skin. The split on her lip had closed, but the shadow inside her, the fear of men, of loud noises, of sudden movements, that was not fading so quickly. Her need to prove her worth was a constant, driving ache. She felt guilty sleeping on the cot while he was in the barn. She felt guilty eating the food he provided. She scrubbed, baked, and mended, trying to make her presence weigh less. One afternoon, he found her trying to lift a heavy cast-iron pot from a low shelf. She was struggling, her face pale with effort. He came and took it from her hands, his voice gruff. "That is too heavy. Let me—" "I can do it," she snapped, and was instantly horrified by her own sharp tone. He set the pot on the stove. He looked at her, his face unreadable. "I know you can, Miss Caldwell. I do not doubt it, but you do not have to." He left the cabin. Zoe sat at the table, her hands shaking. "You do not have to." It was the most confusing sentence she had ever heard. She was beginning to understand that he would not punish her for being weak. He also would not punish her for being strong. He simply seemed to accept what was. The town, for these first few weeks, remained a distant threat. He went alone for supplies. He returned with the mail, a few letters for him, and the Helena Herald. He never mentioned the town. He never reported on the gossip he must have heard. He simply brought the sacks of flour and beans and went back to his work, creating a silent perimeter of safety around the ranch. He began building a new fence, a proper one, for the garden and a small chicken run. "For your work," he'd said, gesturing to the thriving seedlings. One evening, he brought a long, folded garment into the cabin. It was an apron, but it was made of thick, oiled canvas. "I saw your dress," he said, awkward. The stove. It gets greasy. This is what I use in the smithy. It is clean. It will protect your clothes." She took it. It was stiff and smelled of linseed oil. It was a practical, thoughtful gift. A tool, not an adornment. She put it on. It felt like armor. The next week, he brought the old gelding, Sam, to the cabin. "You need to learn to ride," he said. Zoe looked at the horse, her fear immediate. I cannot. I am afraid of horses." "He is gentle," Nathaniel said, patting the horse's neck. "His name is Sam. He is half blind and slower than winter molasses, but you must learn, this is not Boston. If there is a fire, if I am hurt in the field, you must be able to get to town. Your safety depends on it." He did not command, he explained. He made it about her safety, not his convenience. So she learned. Every afternoon, for an hour, he taught her. He showed her how to brush the horse, how to speak to it, how to put the blanket and saddle on its back. He never put his hands on her to correct her posture. He demonstrated. He spoke. "Hold the reins light. Do not pull. He will go where you look." She was stiff, terrified. But Sam was gentle, and Nathaniel was patient. He walked beside her, his hand near the bridle, as she circled the corral. After a week, she was riding on her own, her back straight, her hands light. A month passed. The first green beans appeared in the garden. Zoe had even planted the lavender seeds she had found in her trunk. A small, hopeful act. The cabin was clean. It smelled of baking bread and drying herbs. Then the sky turned a strange, sickly green. Nathaniel, mending harness on the porch, looked up. He sniffed the air. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp. "And bar the window." "What?" "A storm, a bad one. Go!" He ran for the barn, shouting for his horses. Zoe ran inside, her heart pounding. She had never seen a sky that color. She wrestled the heavy wooden bar into place over the window, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow. It screamed, a sound far more terrifying than the usual high lonesome howl. Rain began to fall, not as drops, but as a solid sheet. Then came the sound of stones hitting the roof. Hail. She lit the oil lamp, her hands shaking. She could hear the horses screaming in the barn, a sound of pure terror. The cabin door burst open, and Nathaniel stumbled in, slamming it against the wind. He was soaked, his face grim. The roof in the barn is holding, but... A terrible, rending crash of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin. It was followed by a low, frantic bawling. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the sound. "The calf," he breathed. He had moved the new calf and its mother to a small paddock near the creek that morning. He grabbed his oilskin slicker. "You cannot go out in this," Zoe cried. "The calf will be beaten to death by the hail. The cow is trapped by the fence," he said, already shrugging into the coat. Zoe did not think. She grabbed the thickest wool blanket from her cot. "I am coming with you." "No, it is too dangerous." "You need help," she said, her voice high and tight. "You cannot carry a calf and keep the mother back at the same time." He stared at her for 1 second. He saw the Vermont farm girl, not the Boston victim. He tossed her his other slicker, the one he rarely used. It was far too big, but it would have to do. They stepped out into chaos. The world was a screaming fury of wind, ice, and horizontal rain. The hail was the size of marbles, stinging their faces. "Stay behind me!" he yelled over the storm. They fought their way toward the paddock. The ground was already a sea of mud. They found the cow, wild-eyed with terror, charging the fence line, bawling for her calf. The calf itself was a small, shivering heap against the far fence, already half buried in a drift of hailstones. It was not moving. "Zoe, the gate. Let the mother in. Then get her to the barn. Distract her," he bellowed. Zoe fumbled with the wooden latch, her fingers numb. She got the gate open. The cow charged past her, running to the calf, nosing it, frantic. Nathaniel was already at the calf. He scooped it up. It was limp, but he felt a faint tremor. "It is alive. Get to the barn." He began the long, agonizing trek back, shielding the calf with his own body. Zoe, her slicker flapping, ran ahead of the frantic cow, waving her arms, shouting, her voice stolen by the wind. "This way, come on, Hup Hup." She was terrified, but she did not stop. She was a small, determined figure, leading the full-grown, panicked longhorn toward the shelter. They stumbled into the barn, collapsing into the dry straw. Nathaniel laid the calf down, and the mother immediately went to it, licking it, bawling. "Blanket," he gasped. They rubbed the calf down, their hands working together, trying to force life back into its cold limbs. For a long time, it did not move. Then, it gave a tiny, bleating cry. It lifted its head. Nathaniel and Zoe sat back on their heels in the straw. They were both caked in mud, soaked to the skin, and breathing in ragged gasps. The storm raged outside, but in the barn, there was only the sound of the cow, now a soft, comforting moo, and their own harsh breathing. He looked at her. Her hair was down, plastered to her face. Her hands were raw. She had not cried, she had not screamed, she had not frozen. She had run into the storm. "You did well, Miss Caldwell," he said. She just nodded, unable to speak, her body shaking with cold and adrenaline. He helped her to her feet. Let's get you warm. Back in the cabin, he stoked the fire until it roared. Go, he said, pointing to her room. Get out of those wet things. He turned his back, giving her privacy. She fled to her room, peeling off the cold, wet layers, and wrapping herself in her driest quilt. When she came out, he was sitting by the fire, stripped of his own slicker, a cup of steaming black coffee in his hands. He handed her one. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire drying their clothes, the storm slowly, grudgingly, moving on. The shared danger hung in the air, a new kind of intimacy. They had fought the land together, and they had won. Zoe stared into the flames, the near death of the calf, the primal fury of the storm. It had unlocked something in her. My uncle? She said, her voice so low it was almost part of the fire's crackle. His name is Arthur, my father's brother. Nathaniel did not move. He did not look at her. He just listened, his big hands wrapped around his cup. He gave her the silence, a safe place to put the words. My parents died. Influenza. It was 3 years ago. I was 18. They left money for me, for my dowry, for my life. He was the guardian of the money and of me. She paused, breathing in the smell of the hot coffee. He spent it, all of it. He liked to gamble, bad investments. He told me I was a burden, that I owed him, that I had to repay him. She stopped, her hands twisting in her lap. She could not look at him. The Western Bride Agency, she whispered, the next words tasting like ash. It was not his first idea, the man he tried to make me marry in Boston. He was not a good man. When I refused, that is when I got this. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, where the bruise had been. Nathaniel's hands tightened on his cup, his knuckles white. He said nothing. He just let her words settle. I ran, she said. The agency, a woman there. She helped me. She said she knew a man, a quiet man, in Montana. She said he sounded safe. She finally looked up at him. His face was granite in the firelight. You are not in Boston, Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice a low rumble. You are in Montana, and you are safe here. She held his gaze. He had said it before. At the depot, it had been a promise against the prying eyes of the town. In the cabin, it had been an assurance of her freedom. Now, after the storm, it sounded like a fact. It sounded like the truth. The confession, once spoken, seemed to hang in the air, a physical thing that displaced the smoke from the fire. Zoe sat, twisted in her blanket, her hands clutching her knees. She had told him. She had given him the ugliest parts of her past, and now she felt scoured out, waiting for the judgment that always followed. Nathaniel Reed did not move for a full minute. He stared into the flames, his big hands gripping his empty coffee cup. The only sign of his reaction was a tightening of the muscles along his jaw. The firelight played on his face, making it seem carved from some hard, unyielding stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was not soft. It was a low, heavy rumble, like rocks grinding together. This man, Arthur, he is the one who did this to your face. It was not a question. Zoe could only nod, a tiny, sick movement of her head. And the man in Boston, he continued, his voice still terrifyingly quiet. The one he tried to sell you to, did he? No, Zoe whispered, understanding his unfinished question. I fought. I ran. That was when he hit me, to make me sensible. He locked me in my room. The woman from the agency, she arranged for me to climb out the window. She had the ticket waiting. Nathaniel set his cup on the stone hearth. He did it with a slow, deliberate care that was more frightening than if he had thrown it. He stood up. He walked to the cabin wall, to the 2 wooden pegs where his Winchester rifle rested. He did not take the rifle down. He laid one hand on the cool, oiled stock. He just stood there, his back to her. "Out here," he said, his voice vibrating with a cold, controlled fury. "We do not have many laws from Boston. We have our own, and we have a different way of dealing with men like that." Zoe's breath caught. "No, please, Mr. Reed, I did not tell you for that. I do not want more violence. Violence is his way. It cannot be the answer." He turned from the wall. His face was a grim mask, but his eyes were not wild. They were clear and steady. "I will not ride out to find him. Miss Caldwell, that is not my right, and it is not my way. But this is my land. He is not welcome here, and I will protect what is on it." He looked at her, and his meaning was plain. She was on his land. The storm had passed, but the conversation had changed the air in the cabin more than the weather had. The fragile truce of shared work had been replaced by a raw, shared knowledge. He knew her secret. He knew her shame. The next morning, the world was scrubbed clean and bright. The sky was a pale, aching blue. Nathaniel met her at the door, his hat already on. The quiet, almost hesitant man from the day before was gone. In his place was a man with a new, sharp purpose. "Today, the chores can wait," he said. "We have other work." He did not take her to the garden. He took her to the small corral behind the barn. His Winchester was in his hand. "Mr. Reed," she began, her fear of the weapon immediate. "I do not like them," he said, cutting her off, as if he had read her mind. "I hunt for meat, not for sport, but this," he said, holding the rifle up, "is a tool, like your sewing needle or my axe. It is a tool for saying no when a man's ears are not working." He set up 3 empty tins on a fence post, a good 50 yards away. "You must learn how to use it, not so you can seek trouble, but so you are not helpless if trouble finds you." She had never held a gun. It was heavy, terrifying. It smelled of oil and a faint, sharp tang of burnt powder. "I cannot," she whispered. "You ran from a locked room," he said, his voice calm, but firm. "You rode a stagecoach for 2,000 miles. You survived a hailstorm. You can do this." He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. "Brace it tight. If it is loose, it will kick you." He showed her how to sight down the barrel. "Breathe out, squeeze the trigger, do not pull it." Her first shot was a nightmare. The explosion was deafening, shocking her. The recoil, despite his warning, slammed into her shoulder. A brutal, heavy punch that sent a shock of pain down her arm. She cried out, dropping the rifle, and the shot went wild, kicking up dust 10 feet to the left of the tins. She stood, shaking, tears of pain and fear in her eyes. "Again," he said, his voice unmoved. He picked up the rifle and handed it back to her. It hurt." "Yes," he said, "it does, but not as much as being helpless." Again. She did it. She braced herself, her whole body rigid. She fired. This time she was ready for the kick, and it was still jarring. But she held on. The shot was closer. Again. She shot, and she shot. Her shoulder throbbed. Her ears rang. But with each shot, a small, hard part of her fear was being burned away by the acrid smoke. On the 7th shot, she hit the tin. The clang of the bullet hitting the metal was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. She lowered the rifle, breathing hard. "Good," Nathaniel said. "We will do this every morning." Next, he brought his own mare, Bess. "Sam is gentle," he said, nodding to the old gelding. "But he is slow. Bess is fast. If you must get to town, if you must get to Sheriff Blackwood, you must be able to ride her." Bess was not like Sam. She was spirited, her eyes bright, her head high, but she had been ridden by Nathaniel, a man who was firm but never cruel, and she responded to a steady hand. Zoe, her confidence bolstered by the rifle, mounted. The mare danced, testing her. "Show her you are the boss. Zoe," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "She will not respect fear." Zoe held the reins, her back straight. "Walk on, Bess." The mare walked. They practiced for an hour. Finally, as the sun climbed high, they stopped. "One more thing," he said, his voice dropping. "If a stranger comes, if I am in the fields and someone rides up, he might say I sent him. He might say he is here to help. You will ask him for a word." Zoe looked at him. "A word?" "A password. A safe word. If he cannot say it, you will lock yourself in. And you will have the rifle." He met her gaze. "The word is Vermont." Her breath caught. Vermont, the place she had come from, the place she had told him about, by the fire. A word that only the two of them could possibly know. He had listened. He had remembered. He had woven her past into a key for her future safety. "Vermont?" she repeated. It felt solid on her tongue. A week passed. A new routine settled. Every morning, she practiced with the rifle. The clang of the tin became a familiar, comforting sound. She rode Bess around the corral, her fear of the spirited mare turning into a kind of grudging respect. The ranch felt like a fortress. But a fortress is a place that waits for a siege. It came on a Tuesday. Zoe was in the garden, tying up the bean plants, when she heard the sound of a horse, a single rider, approaching at a steady trot. Her heart leaped into her throat. She looked to the south pasture. Nathaniel was there, a half-mile away, a small figure mending a fence line. Too far. She did not run. She walked, calmly, to the cabin. She went inside. She slid the heavy bar on the door. She went to her alcove, pushed back the curtain, and took the loaded rifle from the pegs Nathaniel had mounted for her. She went to the window, the one by the table, and stood just to the side of it, hidden in the shadow. The rider came into the yard. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face. He wore a tin star on his vest. He reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the quiet cabin, the barred door. "Hello, the house, Nathaniel Reed." Zoe's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the rifle. It was the sheriff. She heard Nathaniel shout from the pasture, and then the sound of Bess's hooves, thundering. He had seen the strange horse and was riding hard. Zoe unbarred the door, stepping out onto the porch, but she kept the rifle in her hands. The barrel pointed at the ground. Nathaniel pulled Bess to a sliding stop, his eyes on the sheriff, then on Zoe, then on the rifle in her hands. A flicker of approval crossed his face. "Sheriff Blackwood, what brings you out?" The sheriff nodded to them both. He was a man who did not waste time on pleasantries. "Reed, ma'am." His eyes lingered on Zoe for a moment, seeing the faded bruise, seeing the rifle. "I was in Helena, rode back yesterday. I have news, and I suspect it concerns you both." Zoe felt the blood drain from her face. "I was at the assay office." Blackwood continued. "And then the hotel. There is a man in Helena, an Easterner. He is asking questions, throwing a lot of money around." "What kind of questions?" Nathaniel asked. He moved, almost unconsciously, to stand on the step just below Zoe, a solid wall between her and the visitor. "He is looking for a young woman," the sheriff said, his gaze shifting to Zoe. "From Boston. Answers to the name of Zoe Caldwell. He says he is her legal guardian." The world tilted. Zoe gripped the rifle, her knuckles white. "He says she is unwell," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "In her mind, that she is prone to fantasies, that she ran away. He has papers, legal papers, he says, signed by a judge in Boston." "He is lying," Zoe said. Her voice was a croak, but it was sharp. Sheriff Blackwood met her gaze. "I figured as much. Ma'am, he's a slick man, but he has cold eyes. and he has 2 men with him. Hired men, not the kind you hire for finding a sick girl, the kind you hire for finding property. Nathaniel's hand rested on the axe handle that was leaning against the porch. Where is he now? Headed this way, Blackwood said. He heard the stage line had a single female passenger for Silverdale about a month back. He will be in town in a day or 2, I reckon. A terrible, cold silence fell. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the new garden fence. The enemy was no longer a shadow. He had a name, he had a face, and he was coming. What do we do? Zoe whispered. Sheriff Blackwood took off his hat, wiping his dusty forehead on his sleeve. Well, he said, that is the question. Right now, ma'am, what is your legal status here? Are you his guest? His employee? She is my intended, Nathaniel said, the word sounding stiff and false. That is not a legal position, Blackwood said bluntly. Not one that will stand up against papers from a guardian. If this Arthur shows up, and you are just a woman living in his cabin, he can make a powerful case. He can say you are a fallen woman. He can say you are compromised. He can say Reed has ruined you. He can use those papers to force you to return with him. I will not let him, Nathaniel said, his voice a low growl. I believe you. Reed, the sheriff said, his voice tired. But I do not want a gunfight on Main Street. That is bad for business. More than that, it is bad for her. He nodded at Zoe. She does not need a shootout. She needs a wall, a legal wall. He put his hat back on. Out here, the law is simple. A married woman is the property, well, the responsibility of her husband. A guardian from Boston has no more say over a married woman in Montana territory than the man in the moon. Her husband's rights come first. Zoe felt her stomach turn to ice. It was the same trap. She was being passed from one owner to another. So I am advising you, the sheriff said, his voice kind but firm. If you mean to stay, and if he means to protect you, you should get married. Right now. Today. Ride into town. I will get the preacher. I will stand as witness. It will be done in 10 minutes. It will be legal. It will be ironclad. This was it, the choice, to be safe from Arthur. She had to chain herself to Nathaniel. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of panic. She saw him, this good, kind, quiet man, and she saw a cage. Nathaniel saw the look. He saw the hunted, desperate terror that he had sworn to banish. He had given her a choice, and now the world was conspiring to take it away. No, Nathaniel said. Both Zoe and Sheriff Blackwood stared at him. Reed, the sheriff said, his voice filled with exasperation. This is not the time for pride. This is about her life. No, Nathaniel said again. His voice was absolute. I told Miss Caldwell she had a choice. I will not use her uncle's evil to force her into a marriage she is not ready for. That is just another kind of theft. It is not a marriage. It is a claim. It is what he is doing. He looked at Zoe, his eyes filled with a deep, aching frustration. I will not make you choose me just because you are afraid of him. That is not a choice. That is just a smaller cage. The sheriff sighed, a long, heavy sound. Reed, you are a stubborn fool, but I suppose you are an honorable one. So what is your plan when he rides into town with his papers and his hired guns? I will tell him to leave, Nathaniel said simply. And if he does not... Nathaniel looked at the rifle still clutched in Zoe's hands. Then he will be trespassing, and we will defend our home. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. He looked at the cabin, at the neat garden, at the new door on Zoe's alcove, which was visible from the yard. He looked at Zoe, who was no longer the bruised, terrified creature he had heard about. She was standing tall, holding a rifle, her eyes clear. The town, he said finally. You should know. The town is on your side. Nathaniel looked shocked. What? This is a small place. Reed, Frank Wilson at the stage office. He talks. Jenkins at the mercantile. He talks. They all saw her face when she arrived. They saw you walk her home. And they all know, he said, a small smile playing on his lips, that you have been sleeping in that barn for over a month. They have been taking bets on how long it would last. Zoe blushed a deep, painful crimson. They all knew. Her private shame, her private arrangement was public gossip. They think you are a fool. Reed. The sheriff said, but they also think you are a decent man. They do not like bullies. This Arthur, he will find me. He will find the law, but he will also find the community. And they will not be on his side. He gathered his reins. But, ma'am, he said, his voice gentle again, the choice is still yours. A marriage certificate is the strongest fence I know. It is clean. It is fast. Think on it. He nodded. I will be in town. Send word if you see anyone. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. They stood on the porch, the threat now a tangible thing, a ticking clock. He is right, Zoe said, her voice flat. I should marry you. It is the only practical solution. Nathaniel turned to her. His face was torn. Do you want to marry me, Zoe? It was the second time he had used her name. It sounded different now, more personal, more freighted. She looked at the ground, at the rough planks of the porch. I do not know what I want. I am grateful to you. Mr. Reed, I respect you more than any man I have ever known, but I am still afraid of all of it, of being a wife. Then we will not do it, he said firmly. We will find another way. There is no other way, she cried, the fear finally breaking through, her voice high. He will take me. He has papers. He will drag me back to Boston, and he will... He will not, Nathaniel said. He did not touch her, but he stepped closer. He will not. You are not the same woman who got off that stage. You are not the same woman from yesterday. You can ride. You can shoot. You have a voice. The sheriff. He will listen to you. She looked at him, her mind racing. He was right. She was different. The rifle in her hands felt solid, not just heavy. The town, she said, thinking hard. The sheriff said the town is on our side. He said, they saw me arrive. Yes. Then I should not hide, she said, a new, cold resolve settling over her. Hiding is what I did in Boston. I ran. You survived, he corrected her, his voice low. I survived, she agreed. But I will not hide any more. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, he saw no fear in her eyes, only determination. We need supplies. You have put off the trip to town for weeks, to protect me. Tomorrow, I will go with you. Nathaniel stared at her. He was stunned. Zoe, the town, they will stare. They will whisper. Let them stare, she said, her voice hard. They saw me when I was broken. It is time they see me standing up. A slow, rare smile transformed Nathaniel's face. It was not a smile of humor. It was a smile of profound, deep respect. All right, Zoe, he said, his voice full of a new warmth. Tomorrow, we will go to town. Together. The ride into town was a slow, deliberate exercise in dread. Nathaniel had hitched the team to the heavy wagon. They needed supplies. A month's worth. And this trip could not be put off any longer. Zoe sat beside him on the hard wooden bench, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was not the bruised, veiled creature who had arrived. She wore her best dark blue dress, neatly mended, and her hair was brushed and tied back, not hidden by a bonnet. She had refused to hide. But as the single dusty main street of Silverdale came into view, her resolve faltered. She felt her shoulders hunch, the old, instinctive posture of a person bracing for a blow. I I am here, she whispered to herself. Nathaniel heard her. He did not look at her, his eyes focused on the road, but he spoke, his voice low. So am I. He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Jenkins's General Mercantile. The street, which had held its usual sleepy Tuesday rhythm, seemed to stop. Frank Wilson, outside the stage office, stopped sweeping. Two prospectors sitting on the boardwalk in front of the saloon stopped their whittling. A woman Zoe recognized from that first day, the one who had been in the store, was crossing the street, and she simply froze, her basket on her arm, and stared. They were a spectacle, the reclusive rancher and his mail-order bride, the one who had arrived like damaged goods. Nathaniel tied off the reins. He set the brake. He was deliberate, his movements unhurried. He turned to her. He did not offer a hand to help her down, an act that would have been one of possession. He simply got down from his own side, his boots hitting the dusty ground, and waited for her. Zoe took a deep breath. She could feel the heat of the sun on her face, but it felt less like warmth and more like a spotlight. She swung her legs over and climbed down, her boots landing softly. She stood by the wagon wheel, feeling 12 feet tall and 2 inches wide. Nathaniel rounded the wagon. He stopped in front of her. He did not say, "Are you ready?" He simply bent his arm, offering her an escort, as if they were walking into a church social. It was a public, profound gesture of respect. He was not hiding her. He was presenting her. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the crook of his elbow. The rough wool of his good shirt was solid beneath her fingers. She lifted her chin. Together, they walked across the boardwalk. The boards creaked. The silence of the street was absolute. The bell over the door of the Mercantile tinkled, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the quiet. Mr. Jenkins was behind his counter, measuring out coffee beans. The woman who had been crossing the street had apparently rushed in ahead of them, and she now stood by the fabric bolts, pretending to inspect a length of calico, though her eyes were fixed on Zoe. Mr. Jenkins looked up. His gaze went from Nathaniel to Zoe, to her hand on Nathaniel's arm, and back to her face. The bruise was gone, but the memory of it hung in the air. Mr. Reed, Jenkins said, his voice strained with false cheer. Good to see you, and, ma'am. Mr. Jenkins? Nathaniel replied, his voice a low rumble. He did not release Zoe's arm. We have a list. We need flour, 2 sacks, coffee, a side of bacon, salt, and 10 yards of that blue ribbon, if you please, for curtains. The request was so domestic, so normal, it seemed to break the spell. Jenkins blinked. Curtains, yes, of course. Zoe felt the woman by the fabric bolts staring. This was the moment. She let go of Nathaniel's arm, stepping forward slightly. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and steady in the small store. And do you have any lavender seeds? Mr. Jenkins, I should like to plant some by the porch. Jenkins stared at her. This was not a broken victim. This was a woman asking for flower seeds. I believe I do, ma'am. He stammered, turning to a drawer of seed packets. Yes, right here. Zoe met his gaze. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. My name is Zoe Caldwell. She had named herself. She was not the woman, or his intended, or that mail-order bride. She was Zoe Caldwell. The woman by the fabric bolts looked down, a faint flush of shame on her cheeks, and she finally began to actually inspect the cloth. Mr. Jenkins, suddenly all business, began scooping the coffee beans with vigor. The first and smallest test had been passed. They spent the next hour gathering their supplies. Nathaniel loaded the heavy sacks onto the wagon. It was past noon. The sun was directly overhead, beating down on the town, bleaching the dust to a fine white powder. The heat was oppressive. Are you hungry? Nathaniel asked. Yes, Zoe said she was. There is one place, he said, nodding down the street. The Silver Load Saloon served a hot meal at midday. It was the only such place in town, It was also the center of the town's social life, a place Zoe would have avoided at all costs. "All right," she said. He did not offer his arm this time. She did not need it. They walked side by side. The saloon was dark and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. A few men at a card table in the back looked up as they entered, their eyes lingering on Zoe. But they said nothing. The eatery was just 2 tables in a small, partitioned area by the front window. The harsh, bright sunlight streamed in, illuminating every speck of dust in the air. They sat. A young woman, wiping her hands on her apron, came to take their order. "Mr. Reed, ma'am, just the stew today." "2 stews, coffee," Nathaniel said. They sat in silence, the clink of glasses and the low murmur of the card players behind them. Zoe felt exposed, the sunlight on her face like an interrogation lamp. The bell on the saloon door rang. "Afternoon, Molly," a deep voice said. Zoe looked up. Sheriff Blackwood was standing there. He saw them, and his face, which had been set in a weary grimness, hardened slightly. He walked over, pulling his hat from his head. "Reed, ma'am," he said. He did not ask to join them. He just pulled out the 3rd chair and sat down, placing his hat on the table between them. The gesture was heavy. Official, it was the law, sitting down at their table. "Sheriff," Nathaniel said, "you have news." "Coffee, Sheriff," the waitress asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, Molly, Black." He waited until she had moved away. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "He is in Helena," he said, his voice low, for their ears only. "I got a wire from the marshal there not an hour ago. He has arrived. He is not asking quiet questions anymore." Zoe felt her hands go cold. "He is telling a story," Blackwood said, his eyes on Zoe. "His name is Arthur Caldwell. He is telling everyone who will listen that his niece, that is you, ma'am, is unwell. Mentally, that you took a large amount of his money and ran away in a fit of delusion." He is lying," Zoe whispered, her throat tight. "I know it," Blackwood said. "But he is a convincing man. He has money, he has papers, and he has 2 men with him. I got a description. They are not local hired guns. They are Pinkerton men. Their job is finding people who do not want to be found, and they are very, very good at it." The waitress brought the stew. It was thick with beef and potatoes. The smell, which should have been comforting, turned Zoe's stomach. She stared at the spoon. "They have been asking about the stage lines," Blackwood continued, ignoring the food. "Every stop between here and Helena. They know a woman matching your description got off in Silverdale. They know she was a mail-order bride for Nathaniel Reed." He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "He will be here. My guess is tomorrow, maybe the day after. He will not come quiet. He will come with those papers and those Pinkerton men. And he will demand the law. That is me. Return his property." Nathaniel's hands were flat on the table. "She is not his property." "She is not," Blackwood agreed. "But this is the hard part, ma'am," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "He is your legal guardian. You are, forgive me, how old?" "I am 21, Zoe said. Blackwood nodded. "That is good. You are of legal age, but he is still your guardian, with papers signed by a judge. It creates a tangle. He will say you are sick. He will say Reed here took advantage of you in your delicate state. He will demand to take you back to Boston, for your own protection." The old nightmare. The room in Boston. The man her uncle wanted her to marry. It was all rushing back, a tide of black, cold fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Blackwood looked at Nathaniel, then back at Zoe. "I told your man here he was a stubborn fool for not marrying you. I was wrong to say it was his choice. It is yours, and I am here, as the law, to tell you the options." He ticked them off on his fingers. 1. You hide. You ride out, and Reed takes you somewhere else. But these Pinkerton men, they will find you. And running will only make you look guilty. It will make him, he nodded at Nathaniel, look like an abductor. 2, we fight. He comes to the ranch. You tell him to leave. He tries to take you. Reed stops him. Guns are drawn. People get shot. Maybe Reed, maybe his men, maybe you. It is a terrible, bloody mess. And even if Reed wins the fight, this Arthur is a rich man. He will send the territorial marshal, and Reed will hang for murder. Zoe looked at Nathaniel. His face was granite. He was willing to do it. The realization made her sick. Or 3, Blackwood said, his voice quiet. The clean option, the legal one. You are sitting here in public. You look well. You look sound of mind. You are talking to me. You are not a prisoner. You are a free woman. You make a free choice. He leaned in, his gaze intense. The preacher is in his study. He is waiting. He has been waiting since I spoke to him this morning. You and Reed, you walk over there. I will be your witness. In 10 minutes, you will be Mrs. Nathaniel Reed, a married woman, a resident of Montana Territory. He tapped his hat on the table. When Arthur Caldwell arrives, I will meet him, and I will tell him that his guardianship is null and void, that a husband's rights, a Montana husband, come before a Boston uncle's. He will have no legal standing. He will have no claim. I can, and I will. Tell him to leave my town. Zoe looked down at the table. The legal fence, the ironclad wall, it was being offered to her. Right now, it was safety. It was salvation. But it was not love. It was a transaction. It was a choice made under duress, a decision forced by a bad man's actions. She looked at Nathaniel. He was watching her. His face was impassive. He was not pleading, not nodding, not encouraging. His silence was profound. He was respecting her, even now, even with the world burning down around them. He was leaving the choice entirely, painfully, in her hands. She thought of his kindness. She thought of the door he had built, the rifle he had taught her to use, the word Vermont. Her hands were trembling so badly she hid them in her lap. "Sheriff, I cannot," she whispered, the words tearing out of her. "I cannot make this choice. Not like this. It is what he wants, to force me, to make me choose a cage." Blackwood sighed. It was a long, heavy sound of frustration. "Ma'am, Zoe, it is not a cage. It is a shield." "It is still a marriage based on fear," she said, and her voice grew stronger, the tears of frustration welling. "And I respect Mr. Reed too much to use him like that, to use marriage as a weapon against Arthur. It is not right." The sheriff looked beaten. He looked at Nathaniel. "Stubborn, both of you. What happens tomorrow? Then when he is standing right where I am?" Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. He looked at Zoe, at her defiance, at the tears she refused to let fall. He reached across the table. He did not grab her hand. He did not pat it. He simply laid his big, calloused hand over hers, his thumb gently pressing the back of it. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was a gesture of absolute, unshakable support. The entire eatery, now silent, saw it. It was an answer. "We thank you for the warning, Sheriff," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet, but carrying. "We will be at the ranch. We will not run, and we will not be bullied. We will tell him no, and you, as the law, will be there to hear us say it." Blackwood stared at their joined hands. He looked at the determination in both their faces. He was a man who understood the law, but he was also a man who understood the West. He was seeing a different kind of law being made at this table. "So be it," he said heavily. He picked up his hat. "I cannot stop him from coming. I cannot stop him from speaking, but I will be there. I will see that he does not lay a hand on you." He stood up. "Eat your stew. It gets cold fast." He turned and left the saloon. The bell tinkled, and he was gone. The silence he left behind was worse. The decision had been made, or rather, postponed. They had chosen the second option. They had chosen the fight. Nathaniel let go of her hand. He picked up his spoon and pushed his stew around. He had no appetite. Zoe looked out the window. The sunlight was relentless. And then she saw him. Across the street, in the deep shadow of the alley between the saloon and the blacksmith shop, a man was standing. He was not a rancher. He was not a prospector. He wore a dark suit and a derby hat. He was clean-shaven. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching the window of the eatery, watching them. He was not Arthur. He was one of the others, one of the Pinkerton men. Zoe's breath caught in her throat, a small, terrified gasp. "Nathaniel," she whispered. Nathaniel looked up, not at her, but at what she was seeing. His eyes narrowed. He saw the man. The man in the alley did not move. He just watched. He was a professional. He was not making a threat. He was making an assessment. He was counting. He was planning. Then, as if he knew he had been seen, he simply took one step back, melting into the deeper shadow of the alley, and he was gone. Nathaniel threw 2 coins on the table, far more than the meal was worth. "We are leaving," he said. His voice was cold. They did not run. They walked, with deliberate speed, out of the saloon and into the blinding sun. They went to the wagon. Nathaniel's eyes scanned every alley, every roofline. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands firm on her waist. He did not linger. He moved to his side, took the reins, and with a sharp hup, he snapped the leather. The wagon lurched forward, faster than it should have, carrying its heavy load. They left Silverdale, the dust rising in a cloud behind them. The stranger was not visible, but they both knew he was there. The siege had begun. The wagon ride back from Silverdale was fast and brutal. Nathaniel pushed the team, his jaw set, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. The heavy wagon, loaded with supplies, rattled and crashed over the ruts. But he did not slow down. Zoe sat beside him, rigid. She did not look at the hills. She did not need to. She could feel the stranger's eyes on her back, a cold, professional assessment that had followed them all the way out of town. The man in the derby hat, the Pinkerton, he was not a bully like her uncle. He was a hunter. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The choice had been made, and the consequences were now hurtling toward them. When they reached the ranch, the sky was a heavy, bruised purple, the air thick and unnaturally still. The silence was worse than the wind had ever been. "Get the supplies inside," Nathaniel said. His voice clipped. He did not wait for her. He began unhitching the team, his movements fast and angry. He would not leave his horses in the open. Zoe worked, her body numb with dread. She hauled the smaller sacks of sugar, salt, and coffee into the cabin. He followed with the 100-pound sacks of flour, one on each shoulder, his muscles straining. They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency, stacking everything by the door. As Nathaniel carried the last sack inside, the stillness broke. It was not a gradual wind. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that slammed into the cabin, making the new door to Zoe's alcove rattle in its frame. A single heavy drop of rain, cold and fat, struck the porch. Then another, and then the sky ripped open. This was not the hailstorm. That had been a violent, sharp assault. This was a deluge, a roar of wind and water that seemed to signal the end of the world. The world was suddenly gray, all light and land erased by a solid, moving sheet of water. Nathaniel slammed the main door and dropped the bar. "The window!" he ordered. Zoe rushed to drop the heavy bar across the window, plunging the cabin into the dim, claustrophobic light of the single oil lamp she had lit. The sound was deafening. The wind screamed, a high, thin note of fury over the bass roar of the rain. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress, now felt like a small, wooden chip in a violent ocean. "He is coming," Zoe whispered, her voice lost in the noise. This is God's own anger." "It is just a storm," Nathaniel said, but his face was grim. He was listening. And then they heard it, a sound, louder than the wind, more terrible than the rain. A crack like a cannon shot, followed by a long, scraping screech of wood. "The barn," Nathaniel breathed. He ran to the door, pulling the bar back. The wind ripped the door from his hand, slamming it open against the cabin wall. "Stay here," he bellowed. "No," she screamed back, grabbing the oilskin slicker. "The stock." He was already gone, a dark shape swallowed by the gray. She followed, pulling the heavy coat on, the wind tearing at her, the rain instantly plastering her hair to her face. The barn was chaos. The massive double door on the east side, the one that faced the open prairie, had been torn from its upper hinge. It was hanging by one iron loop, slamming against the barn wall with every gust, a battering ram threatening to bring the whole structure down. Inside, the horses were screaming, their eyes white, kicking at their stalls. The milk cow and the calf they had saved were bawling, huddled in the far corner. Nathaniel was already there, a coil of heavy rope in his hands, trying to get close to the door. A gust hit, and the door, weighing hundreds of pounds, slammed shut, missing his shoulder by inches. "It will kill the horses," he yelled. "We have to tie it." "How?" "I have to get outside. I need to rope it from the post. But you have to hold it when the wind drops. You have to push it closed." "It is too heavy." "Just for a second, I just need slack." He waited, his body tensed. The wind drew a breath. "Now!" he roared. He threw his entire weight against the splintered door. Zoe added hers. It was like pushing against a mountain. The wood was slick with rain. "It is not moving," she cried. Again. They shoved. The door scraped, moving a foot. Nathaniel grabbed a stray piece of lumber. "Jam it when I say." He pushed. The wind fought him. "Now." She jammed the wood into the gap. It held. "Do not move," he shouted, and ran, disappearing back into the gray deluge. Zoe was left alone in the doorway, the wind trying to rip the slicker from her body. The horses were still frantic. She was pressed against the door, her shoulder aching, the timber she was holding vibrating with the force of the wind. She was terrified, but it was a clean terror. It was not the sick, cold dread of her uncle, or the predatory stillness of the Pinkerton. This was the land, raw and angry, and she could fight it. She saw him, a ghost, in the rain, battling his way to the large hitching post 20 feet from the barn. He was wrestling with the rope, his fingers no doubt numb. "Zoe!" he roared. His voice was torn from his throat. "Pull the wood, let it go!" She pulled the timber free. The door slammed open with a terrible bang. Nathaniel, on the other side, threw the loop of the rope over the edge. "Now," he bellowed. Push it shut." He was pulling from the outside, using the post as an anchor. She pushed from the inside, her boots slipping in the mud and straw. The door began to move, groaning, closing the gap, inch by inch. They fought the wind. It closed. "Hold it!" he yelled. She heard him on the other side, hammering, using stray spikes he must have grabbed, nailing the door shut against its frame. The thud, thud, thud of the hammer was a sound of desperate, furious survival. He stumbled back inside, his chest heaving. The door was sealed. The barn was dark, save for her lamp, and the sound of the storm was muffled, the terrible slamming gone. The horses were still nervous, but the screaming had stopped. Nathaniel leaned against the wall, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at her. She was a mirror of him caked in mud, dripping water, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "You did it," he said, breathing hard. "We did it," she replied. They stood there for a long moment. the shared danger forming a bond tighter than any public vow. They had saved the ranch. "Back to the cabin," he said. "It is not safe here if the roof goes." They ran, heads down, back to the small, solid box of the cabin. He slammed the door, barred it, and for a moment they just leaned against it, breathing. The cabin was an island of warm, dry lamplight in a world gone mad. The fire in the stove was still glowing. The roar of the wind outside was terrifying. But it was outside. The threat was real, but it was known. It was not the silent, watching man in the alley. "You must get dry," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You will catch your death." He did not move, but turned his back to her, a gesture that was now a familiar, respectful ritual. "Go, I will stoke the fire." Zoe fled to her alcove. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely undo the buttons of her dress. She was cold, so cold her teeth were chattering. She stripped off the wet, muddy layers and scrubbed herself dry with her thin towel. She pulled on her flannel nightgown and a thick wool robe, the warmest thing she owned. She came out. He was at the stove, his back still to her, adding wood. He had stripped off his own slicker and wet shirt. He was bare from the waist up, his back a landscape of broad, defined muscle, the firelight playing on his damp skin. Zoe stopped. She had never seen him like this. He was a powerful man, his body shaped by hard, relentless labor. He must have heard her, because he turned. He had a dry shirt in his hand. He was not embarrassed. His body was a tool, like his axe, and it was wet. He pulled the dry shirt on, his movements quick and functional. "Better," he said. He nodded to her. "You?" "Yes," she whispered, clutching her robe tighter. He poured coffee. His hands were shaking. She realized, not from cold, but from adrenaline. He handed her a cup. Their fingers brushed. It was the slightest contact, but it sent a jolt through her, as sharp as the thunder. They sat by the fire, he on his stool, she on the small rag rug she had made. The storm was their only chaperone, a deafening, violent roar that sealed them in. The oil lamp on the table cast a small, golden circle, leaving the rest of the cabin in shadow. Outside, the forces of her past were gathering. The man in the derby hat, her Uncle Arthur, with his legal papers and his cold eyes. They were coming. Tomorrow. But tonight there was just this, the fire, the storm, and this man who had fought the wind for her, this man who had taught her to shoot, who had given her a key, this man who, in the saloon, had refused to claim her, refused to force her, even to save them both. He had honored her choice, even when it was dangerous. She looked at his hands, wrapped around the coffee cup. They were scarred, the knuckles split, the nails blunt. They were the hands that had built her a door, planted a garden, and gently, so gently, covered hers at the table. She was still afraid. The terror of her uncle was a deep, cold root. But the fear of Nathaniel, that was gone. It had been washed away in the storm, hammered out with the nails in the barn door. "Nathaniel," she said. He turned his head. His name on her lips was new, a fragile thing. "In town," she said, her voice quiet, but clear beneath the wind's howl. "The sheriff. He was right. It was the practical choice." Nathaniel's face tightened. "We will not speak of that, not now." "Yes," she said, "we will." She put her cup down. "He was right, but you were also right. It would have been a choice made from fear. It would have been a cage." He watched her, his gray eyes intent, waiting. She took a breath. This was harder than facing the storm. I have been so afraid my whole life. Afraid of him. Afraid of being owned. Afraid of men. Of being touched." He said nothing. He just listened. "When you touched my hand today, in the saloon, I was not afraid. It was the first time a man's touch has ever felt safe. She looked at the fire. I am still afraid of tomorrow. I am still afraid of Arthur, but Nathaniel, she looked at him, and her eyes were clear. I am not afraid of you? He did not move. He seemed to be carved from stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. She moved. It was the smallest motion. She slid on the rug, closing the foot of space between them. She reached out, her hand trembling, and she laid it on his knee, on the rough denim. He did not react for a second. Then, slowly, he covered her hand with his own. His skin was warm, calloused, and strong. Zoe, he breathed, his voice rough. I cannot make this choice because of him, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I will not let him win. I will not let him be the reason. She looked up at him, her gaze traveling from his strong throat to his firm mouth, to his steady, gentle eyes. I want to make this choice because of you, because you are a good man, because you built me a door, because you see me, and you let me be free. She leaned in, a tiny, hesitant motion. I choose you, Nathaniel, not for safety, not for the law, for you. He could finally move. He set his cup down, and he moved from the stool to the floor, kneeling in front of her. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He framed her face with his two big hands, his thumbs gently brushing her cheekbones, the place where the bruise had been. Zoe, he whispered, you do not know what you are saying. I do, she said, and she leaned into his touch. She did not flinch. I do. He looked at her, his eyes asking the question he would not speak. She gave him the answer. She closed her eyes and leaned forward, closing the last inch between them. His lips were not soft, they were chapped, firm, and they tasted of coffee and the clean, cold rain. It was a kiss of utter stillness. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was a question. She answered by pressing back, her hands coming up to rest on his powerful, solid shoulders. He pulled back, just enough to look at her. His eyes were dark, full of a hunger he had held back for so long it was a physical pain. But it was a hunger held in check by a profound, unbreakable respect. Zoe, he whispered her name, his voice thick. She was the one who kissed him this time, deeper. She was the one who opened her hand against his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart under her palm. It was the steadiest thing she had ever known. He kissed her throat, a gentle, warm pressure, and she shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. Nathaniel, she whispered, her voice catching. She had to set the last boundary. Please, I am still, it must be slow. He rested his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged. He was fighting a battle, and he was winning it. Zoe, I will not ever, he breathed, his words a vow. Do anything you do not ask for. I will stop. I will always stop. All you have to do is say the word. This was intimacy. This was the safety she had craved more than food or shelter. The freedom to say no, which was the only thing that gave her the freedom to say yes. She smiled, a small, trembling smile. Do not stop. He untied the belt of her wool robe, his movements slow, almost hesitant. He was giving her every second to change her mind. He pushed the heavy wool from her shoulders. She sat before him in her simple flannel gown, the firelight bathing her in warmth. He did not rush. He kissed her shoulder. He kissed the hollow of her throat. Each touch was a question, and with every second she did not pull away. She was answering. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. He was real. He was not a dream. He lifted her then. His arms were powerful, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He did not carry her to his bed. He carried her to her alcove, to her room, the sanctuary he had built for her. He laid her on the small cot, her cot, and he followed her down. The oil lamp was in the other room, its light blocked by the door. Here, there was only the flickering orange glow from the fire, painting shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm raged, the wind screaming, the rain lashing the cabin. It was the voice of her past, the voice of Arthur, the voice of the Pinkerton, all howling to get in. But in the small, warm dark, they were safe. He covered her body with his, a weight that was not a burden, but a shield. He kissed her, and the sound of the storm faded, replaced by the sound of her own name, spoken like a prayer, and the steady, solid beat of his heart, right next to hers. "You are not alone now," he whispered against her skin, using his own words. She held him tighter. "No," she breathed, her voice sure for the first time. "Neither are you." They lay there for a long time, listening to the world try to tear itself apart. But the cabin held. The walls were strong. Finally, Zoe spoke, her voice muffled against his chest. "Tomorrow." He kissed the top of her head. "Tomorrow, we will face him." "Yes," she said. She pulled back, just enough to look him in the eyes, her gaze fierce in the dark. "And then, after, we will go to the church." He stilled. "Zoe, not because of him." "No," she said, her voice full of a strength he had never heard before. "Because of us. We will go because I choose it. Because I choose you." He held her, and for the first time since he had built the cabin, the high, lonesome sound of the wind seemed very far away. The world was born new. The storm had passed in the darkest hours of the night, leaving a sky so clean and blue it hurt the eyes. The air smelled of ozone, wet pine, and clean, scoured earth. Inside the cabin, the small, quiet space that had become her sanctuary. Zoe woke first. She had not slept, not truly, but had rested in the circle of Nathaniel's arms on her own small cot. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. His face, so often set in lines of worry and tension, was peaceful in the gray light of dawn. She slipped from the cot, pulling her robe around her. The cabin was cold. The fire had died to embers. She moved to the stove, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She began the simple, domestic act of building a fire, splitting the kindling, laying the wood. It was his chore. It was the first sound he heard every morning. Today, she claimed it. He woke as the tinder caught, the smell of wood smoke filling the air. He did not startle. He just opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze clear and steady. The night had happened. It was real. "Good morning, Nathaniel," she said, her voice soft. "Good morning, Zoe," he replied. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. He looked around the small room. Her room, and the man who had slept in the barn for over a month seemed to finally understand that he was home. They did not speak of the night. It was a fragile, perfect thing, and to speak of it would be to risk breaking it. Instead, they spoke of the day. "The wagon," he said, rising and pulling on his boots. "I must check the team. The storm—" "I will make coffee," she said. The morning chores were a shared, quiet dance. The barn had held. His repair on the door was ugly, but it was strong. The stock was nervous, but unharmed. The world, which had tried to tear itself apart, had been held back by two people and a few lengths of rope. When the sun was fully risen, Nathaniel hitched the wagon. Zoe came out of the cabin. She was not wearing her work dress. She was wearing the same dark blue dress she had worn to town the day before. It was clean and pressed. "You are ready," he said. "Yes," she said. He helped her onto the wagon seat. This time, his hands on her waist were not just functional. They lingered for a second. It was a touch of possession, but a possession freely given. The ride to town was slow. The road was a river of mud, the creek swollen. Debris was everywhere, branches, leaves, a tumbleweed caught against a fence. They did not speak of Arthur. They did not speak of the Pinkerton. They spoke of the land. "The storm has filled the creek," he said, pointing. "That is good for the summer pasture." "The garden is flooded," she said, her voice full of worry. "The new lavender—" "We will plant it again," he said. "It will grow. Things are hard to kill out here." She knew he was not just talking about plants. When Silverdale came into view, it looked as battered as their ranch. The sign for the mercantile was hanging by one hinge. The street was a sea of churned mud. But the town was alive. People were out, already beginning the work of repair. Nathaniel did not stop at the church. He stopped, just as he had the day before, in front of Jenkins's General Mercantile. "Nathaniel?" Zoe asked, confused. "Wait here," he said. He went inside. Mr. Jenkins was sweeping water out his front door. He looked up, his face tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Reed," Jenkins said. "You weathered it, then?" "We did," Nathaniel said. He walked to the counter. He spoke, his voice low. But Zoe, waiting on the wagon, could hear him clearly. "Mr. Jenkins, I need a ring." Jenkins stopped sweeping. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked out the door at Zoe, who was sitting tall on the wagon, her hands in her lap. "Just a ring," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with embarrassment. "A gold one. I do not have much, but I will pay." Mr. Jenkins was silent for a moment. He looked at this big rough rancher, who had slept in his own barn for a month. He thought of the gossip. He thought of the bruised woman who had arrived. He went to a small glass case, the one that held buttons, lace, and a few pieces of cheap jewelry. He unlocked it. He took out a small, thin band of gold. It was not fancy. It was not worth much. "This one," Jenkins said. "It was my mother's. She said it was for a woman who deserved it." He pushed it across the counter. Nathaniel reached for his pocket. "How much?" "It is a bad day for business." "Reed," Jenkins said, his voice suddenly gruff. "The roof leaked. I am in no mood for haggling. Just take it, and go get that girl properly seen to. The sheriff has been pacing the street all morning." Nathaniel stared at the ring. He looked at Jenkins, the small storekeeper, the center of the town's gossip, was their first ally. "I am in your debt," Nathaniel said. "We all are," Jenkins said, turning back to his sweeping. "Now, go on. You are blocking the light." Nathaniel came back out, the small, thin band of gold heavy in his hand. He climbed onto the wagon. He did not give it to her. He did not say a word. He just clutched it in his fist and unwrapped the reins. He drove the last 50 yards to the small white church. Sheriff Blackwood was there, just as Jenkins had said. He was sitting on the steps, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as they approached. His face was a mask of grim relief. "Reed, ma'am," he said, standing up, tossing the sliver of wood away. "You made a choice, then." "We did," Nathaniel said. "He is not here," Blackwood said, his voice low, as he helped Zoe down. "Not yet, but the stage from Helena is due in an hour. It is best we do this now." The church was cool and quiet, smelling of damp plaster and old wood. The storm had broken one of the windows, and the glass had been neatly swept away. The Reverend, a thin older man with kind eyes, was waiting at the altar. "Mr. Reed, Miss Caldwell," the Reverend said. He did not look surprised. He looked as if he had been expecting them all along. We would like to be married, Reverend," Nathaniel said, his voice echoing in the small, empty church. "I see," the Reverend said. He looked at Zoe. "Miss Caldwell, is this your free choice?" Zoe looked at Nathaniel. He was standing beside her, his hat in his hands, his face set. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the cross, giving her the space to answer for herself. "Yes," Zoe said, her voice clear and strong. "It is." "Then let us begin." the Reverend said. It was the simplest ceremony. There was no music. There were no flowers. Their only witnesses were Sheriff Blackwood, who stood by the door, his hand on his gun, and God. The Reverend spoke the old words, of sickness and health, of richer and poorer. They were words that meant something out here. They were not just poetry. They were a contract of survival. "The ring, Mr. Reed," the Reverend prompted. Nathaniel opened his fist. He showed her the ring. It was a simple, thin band. She held out her hand. It was trembling, but not from fear. He slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "With this ring," he said, his voice thick, "I thee wed." "Until death do us part," Zoe finished, her eyes locked on his. "Then by the power vested in me by God and by the laws of Montana Territory," the Reverend said, "I pronounce you man and wife. You may, you may sign the register." It was not a kiss, it was a book, the law. He opened the thick leather-bound volume on the podium. Nathaniel signed first. Nathaniel T. Reed. His handwriting was rough, strong. Then the Reverend turned the book to her. He handed her the pen. She dipped it in the ink. She looked at the line. Zoe Caldwell. She wrote the name, her old name, the name of the victim, the name of the runaway. And then, on the line below, the Reverend pointed. "And here, ma'am, as your new signature." She wrote again, Zoe Reed. It was done. The wall was built. She was no longer Zoe Caldwell of Boston. She was Zoe Reed of Montana. Sheriff Blackwood cleared his throat from the door. "Reverend, folks, I believe the stage is coming in." The moment of peace was shattered. The sound of the stage, the jingle of the harness, the shout of the driver, drifted through the broken window. "He will be on it," Blackwood said. "It is best we meet him now. In the open, in front of everyone." "Zoe," Nathaniel said, turning to her. "I am ready," she said. She was not, but she was. They walked out of the church, husband and wife. They stepped onto the boardwalk. The town was still there, people clearing debris. Frank Wilson was at the stage depot. Jenkins was on his porch. The stage, muddy and leaning, pulled to a stop. The door opened. The first man out was not Arthur. It was the man from the alley, the Pinkerton. He was dressed in the same dark suit, his derby hat set squarely on his head. He stepped down, his cold eyes scanning the street. He saw Blackwood. He saw Nathaniel. And he saw Zoe standing beside him. The second man out was just like him, another professional. They flanked the door. The third man to emerge was Arthur Caldwell. Zoe's breath hitched. He was smaller than she remembered, but his presence was suffocating. He was dressed in expensive Eastern clothes, his face pale with rage and travel. He saw her, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Zoe," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "Your little game is over. You will come with me now." Nathaniel took a step forward. His hands were clenched into fists. He was ready to end this, the Montana way. Zoe's hand shot out, not in fear, but to stop him. She laid her hand on his chest. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Not his way. Not with violence. With this." She touched the new, thin ring on her finger. "Our way." Nathaniel stopped. He looked at her, his eyes blazing. He unclenched his fists. He nodded. Sheriff Blackwood stepped off the church porch and into the middle of the muddy street. "That is far enough, Mr. Caldwell." Arthur turned, his face a mask of incredulous fury. "And who are you?" "Sheriff Blackwood. I am the law in Silverdale." "Then you will do your duty." "Sheriff," Arthur said, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat. "This is a court order from Boston. This woman, Zoe Caldwell, is my ward. She is mentally infirm, a danger to herself. She has stolen from me. I am here to reclaim my property." The two Pinkerton men moved, standing just behind Arthur's shoulders. Their hands were on their coats. Mr. Caldwell, Blackwood said, his voice calm and loud, so the whole street could hear. I appreciate your journey, but your papers are no good here. What? Arthur's voice cracked. That is a legal document. It is, Blackwood agreed. But it is a Boston document, and this, he said, gesturing to Zoe, is a Montana resident.
She is my ward,
Arthur shrieked. No, Blackwood said. She is not. He smiled, a thin, hard smile. As of 10 minutes ago, in that church, she became Mrs. Nathaniel Reed. The street went silent. Arthur's mouth opened and closed. It is a sham, he finally sputtered. A trick. She was forced, he abducted her. She is sick. She cannot make such a choice. He pointed at Zoe. Tell him, Zoe, tell this backwards sheriff that you are unwell. Tell him you were forced. This was the moment. The entire town was watching. Jenkins had stopped sweeping. Frank Wilson stood, his mouth open. Zoe Reed let go of her husband's arm. She took 2 steps forward, leaving the shelter of the church porch, leaving the shelter of Nathaniel. She stood in the mud of the street, her blue dress dark against the filth, her head held high. She looked at her uncle. I am not sick, Arthur, she said, her voice ringing across the street, clear as a bell. I am not your ward, and I am not your property. She held up her left hand, the simple gold band, a gift from a stranger, caught the morning sun. My name is Zoe Reed, she said. I am of sound mind, and I am here of my own free will. This is my home. And that, she said, turning to point at Nathaniel, is my husband. Arthur's face went purple. You lie. That is enough, Caldwell, Blackwood snapped.
It is a lie,
Arthur screamed at the Pinkerton men.
She is delusional. Take her.
The 2 men did not move. Their cold eyes assessed the situation. They saw a unified town. They saw a sheriff who was not backing down. They saw a minister standing on the church steps. And they saw a very large, very angry rancher standing next to his wife. Their job was to retrieve property, not to start a war they could not win. Mr. Caldwell, the first Pinkerton man said, his voice a low, professional monotone. Our contract is for the retrieval of an uncontested ward. This situation is contested. The local authority does not recognize your claim.
You work for me,
Arthur shrieked. And we value our lives, the man said. The contract is void. Arthur was cornered, and he was unraveling. You cannot do this. She owes me. I am ruined. That money, she has to repay me, the man in Boston. He offered 10,000. He had said it. He had confessed. He was not a guardian. He was a seller. So that is it, Blackwood said, his voice soft but deadly. $10,000. That was her price. You are not just a bully, Caldwell. You are a slaver. He looked at the townsfolk. You all heard him? Jenkins spat in the dust. We heard him. Mr. Caldwell, Frank Wilson shouted. The stage to Helena leaves in 10 minutes. I suggest you be on it. Arthur looked around. He was surrounded, not by guns, but by a wall of decent, angry faces. He had no power here. His Eastern money, his Boston papers, they were just paper. Defeated, he seemed to shrink. The anger drained away, leaving a small, pathetic, terrified man. He looked at Zoe, his eyes full of a new, desperate hatred. You, he whispered. Nathaniel took a step forward.
Go, now!
Arthur scrambled back, climbing into the stagecoach without even looking. The 2 Pinkerton men, their job finished, glanced at Blackwood. Blackwood nodded. They got on the coach after him. The driver cracked his whip. The stage lurched, turned, and began the long, slow journey back to Helena. When it was gone, out of sight, the street was quiet. Zoe Reed was still standing in the mud, her hand held out, the ring shining. She was shaking, a deep, shuddering tremor of release. Nathaniel came to her. He did not say anything. He just took her hand, the one with the ring, and he held it. He looked at Sheriff Blackwood.
Sheriff,
he said.
Reed.
Blackwood nodded. Mrs. Reed. He touched the brim of his hat. I will wire the marshal in Helena. I will tell him the situation is resolved, and I will tell him about Mr. Caldwell's business dealings. I do not think he will be back. The main threat was broken. It had not broken with a gunshot. It had broken with a signature, and with a single, clear voice. Nathaniel turned to his wife. He looked at the ring on her finger. It is time to go home, he said. He led her to the wagon, helped her up, and climbed beside her. He took the reins, he turned the wagon around, and they left Silverdale. This time, together. The ride home from Silverdale was almost silent. The street, the mud, the accusing face of Arthur Caldwell, all of it receded behind them. Zoe Reed sat on the wagon bench, her left hand resting in her lap. The thin gold band felt impossibly heavy, a solid, tangible thing. It was not a shackle, it was an anchor. Nathaniel's shoulders, which had been rigid with a barely contained violence, slowly relaxed as the town disappeared. He did not speak, but the tension drained from him, leaving only a deep, profound weariness. They had won. It had been a victory without a single shot fired, a victory of words, of law, and of community. When they reached the ranch, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air, scoured clean by the storm, was bright and sharp. The cabin, which had been their shared fortress, now felt different. It was, in the eyes of the law and the land, their home. He helped her down from the wagon. His hands, as they had the day before, lingered at her waist. But this time, it was not the hesitant touch of a lover. It was the steady, confident touch of a husband. That night, the awkwardness returned, but it was of a different kind. The night of the storm had been a raw, desperate finding of comfort in the face of fear. This was the first night of a marriage, a thing made real by paper and ink. Nathaniel looked at the main room, at his bed in the corner, and then at the new solid door he had built for her alcove.
Zoe,
He began, his voice rough.
a husband, I should not. Your room is your own.
She looked at the door, her sanctuary, the first place she had ever felt truly safe. Then she looked at him, the man who had given it to her. It is my room, she agreed, her voice soft. But she walked across the cabin to his bed, the one he had slept in alone for so long. She touched the good quilt, the one he had first given her. This is a small cabin for 2 rooms, Nathaniel, but it is a large one for 1. He watched her, his heart in his throat. She smiled, a small, sure smile. I think the alcove is a very good place for storing our winter clothes. He did not move for a long second. Then he crossed the room to her. He did not speak. He just took her hand, the one with the ring, and raised it to his lips. He kissed the ring, and then her fingers. The promise was sealed again, not with the law, but with simple, quiet intent. Life settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of we. Nathaniel no longer slept in the barn. The sound of his deep, steady breathing in the dark was a comfort, a wall against the high, lonesome wind. The small cabin, once a box of masculine solitude, began to fill with the small sounds of a shared life, the murmur of their voices over supper, the scrape of her chair as she moved, the soft thud of his boots by the door. Zoe changed. The frantic, desperate need to earn her keep, to prove her worth through endless labor, faded. She still worked harder than ever, but it was with the easy, confident authority of a partner. She took his small, messy ledger book, the one filled with his rough, masculine script, and she transformed it. My father taught me figures, she explained one evening, the oil lamp illuminating the neat columns she had drawn. You paid too much for that seed grain from Jenkins in March, and these 2 steers you sold, you should have held them. They were underweight. We will bargain better next spring. Nathaniel watched, his mind reeling. He was a man of the land, of wood and horses and weather. She was a woman of numbers, of logic, of order. He had married a stranger, a victim. He had discovered a partner. He, in turn, softened. The hard, silent shell he had built around himself cracked. He began to talk. He told her about the land, about the failed homesteaders who had been there before him. He told her about his parents, who had died of cholera on the trail, leaving him alone at 17. He had never told another living soul. He found her, one afternoon, weeping in the flooded garden, the small patch where her lavender seeds had been washed away by the storm. She was not crying for Arthur. She was crying for the small, hopeful things she had planted. He said nothing, but the next time he went to town, he returned not just with flour, but with a small, carefully wrapped packet. He handed it to her. It was filled with lavender seeds. Jenkins! He had to order them from Helena. He mumbled, embarrassed. He said, "They are the French kind. They are supposed to be hardy." She did not thank him. She just stood on the porch and cried. And he stood there, his big hands at his sides, letting her. When she was finished, she simply took his hand and held it. Summer deepened into a hot, productive autumn. The garden, replanted and thriving, gave them beans and potatoes. The calf was fat and healthy. They worked side by side, harvesting, mending, preparing for the inevitable winter. The town, which had been a place of dread, became a place of quiet acceptance. When they rode in, they were no longer a spectacle. They were just the Reeds. Mr. Jenkins's wife, a woman Zoe had never spoken to, pressed a jar of spiced apple butter into her hands. A wedding gift, the woman had said, blushing. "It is late, but welcome to Silverdale, Mrs. Reed." Then, as the first cold snap turned the aspen leaves to a brilliant, dying gold, Zoe's energy faltered. She, who was always the first to rise, was now tired. The smell of the coffee she made for Nathaniel in the morning made her sick. One evening, she was sitting at the table, staring at the ledger, when a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the table. Nathaniel, who had been oiling a harness, was at her side in an instant. His large hand was on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Zoe, are you ill?" She looked at him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a kind of terrified, dawning wonder. She had been so focused on the threat from the outside. She had not recognized the profound change from within. "Nathaniel," she whispered, covering his hand with her own. I am not ill. I think I am with child." The cabin was silent. He did not shout for joy. He did not smile. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, hard. He looked at her. He looked at her belly, still flat under her apron. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred. He was going to be a father. This rough, strong man, who had faced down storms and Pinkertons, was undone by a simple, quiet fact. A new, fierce, and gentle terror filled his eyes. He had been a protector. He had become a husband, and now he was to be a father. "A baby," he breathed. He reached across the table, his hand trembling, and he touched her cheek, the place where the bruise had been. "Our baby." Winter came. It came not as a storm, but as a slow, inevitable siege. The first snows fell in late October, soft and silent, and they did not melt. The world shrank. The high mountain passes were locked. The road to Silverdale became a treacherous, icy path. They were alone, truly alone, locked in by the cold. But the cabin, which had been a place of stark loneliness, was now a haven of warmth. The threat of Arthur Caldwell was a distant, cold memory. Sheriff Blackwood had sent word. One last time before the passes closed. Arthur had been arrested in Boston. His web of debt and deceit had unraveled. He was gone. The winter was long, but it was not lonely. In the evenings, the wind howled, the old, lonesome sound. But inside, Nathaniel sat by the stove, reading. He owned 3 books of Bible, an almanac, and a thick, battered copy of Shakespeare. He read to her, his voice a low, careful rumble, stumbling over the strange words. Zoe sat opposite, her hands busy, her belly swelling under her dress. She was stitching a blanket, a small one. It was made from the wool of the quilt Jenkins' wife had given them, and on it she embroidered. She did not embroider flowers or lambs. She embroidered snowflakes, dozens of them, each one different, each one intricate and perfect. She was taking the very symbol of the cold, the isolation that had terrified her, and she was making it beautiful. Nathaniel had his own project. In the corner of the cabin, he worked. He had found a piece of clear, perfect pine. With his knife and a small saw, he was carving. He worked slowly, his big hands surprisingly gentle. He was making a cradle. It was not ornate. It was simple, solid, and safe, like the man who made it. The months passed. The world was white and silent. Then, in the deepest, darkest heart of February, the wind returned. It came with a vengeance, a blizzard that dwarfed the storms that had come before. For 2 days, the world was a screaming white void, the snow piled in drifts as high as the cabin roof. And in the middle of the second night, Zoe woke with a sharp, grasping pain. She sat up in the dark. "Nathaniel?" He was awake instantly. "What is it?" The baby!" she gasped, as another contraction seized her. It is time." He was out of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floor. He lit the lamp. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "No, not now, not in this. It is too soon." "It is not soon," she breathed, gripping the bed frame. "It is now." "I must get help," he said, his mind racing. "The midwife, Sarah Hendricks. She is 5 miles south." "You cannot," Zoe cried, the terror of the storm mixing with the pain. "You will die. Nathaniel, the drifts. You will never make it." "I will make it," he said. He was already pulling on his thickest woolens, his heavy coat. He looked at her, his face a mask of desperate resolve. "I left you alone once. I will not leave you alone for this." He kissed her, a hard, fast kiss. "Bar the door behind me. I will be back. I swear it." He was gone. The door eased shut, and only the wind and his quiet struggle with it was her only companion. The ride was a nightmare. He took Bess, the mare, fighting him, plunging into drifts that came up to her chest. The world a chaos of driving, blinding snow. He could not see. He rode by memory, by the invisible line of the creek bed. The cold was a physical thing, stealing his breath, burning his lungs. But he did not stop. He thought of Zoe, alone in the cabin, and he spurred the horse on. It took him 2 hours to travel 5 miles. He was half frozen, his beard a mask of ice. When he reached the Hendricks ranch, he fell from the saddle and hammered on their door. Sarah Hendricks, a woman as tough and weathered as the land itself, opened it. "Lord God, read. What is it?" "It is Zoe," he gasped, his words frozen. "The baby! It is coming!" Sarah did not waste a second. "Josiah," she bellowed to her husband. "Hitch the sleigh. The team. Now read. Get in here by the fire before you freeze solid." I cannot. I have to." "You will go back with me," she said, already pulling on her own heavy coats, grabbing a thick leather bag. "You are no good to her dead." The ride back was just as terrible, but the sleigh, pulled by 2 strong draft horses, was steadier. They found the cabin, a small mound in the snow, the lamplight a faint, golden beacon. Nathaniel burst in. Zoe was on the bed, her face slick with sweat, her teeth gritted against the pain. She was alone. She was terrified.
Zoe,
he breathed, falling to his knees beside the bed. You came back, she wept. I told you I would. Sarah Hendricks was already at work, all business. Stove, read, water, boiled, all the clean cloths you have, and get out of those wet things. This is my space now. The cabin, their haven, became a battlefield. The storm howled outside, a high, thin scream, but inside, the only sounds were Zoe's ragged breathing, Sarah's low, calm commands, and the crackle of the fire. It was a long, hard labor. Zoe was small, and the night was long. Nathaniel, no longer the terrified husband, became her anchor. He sat behind her, letting her brace herself against his solid chest. He held her hands. He wiped her face with a cool cloth, and he spoke to her, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. You are strong. Zoe, you are so strong. You faced down a storm. You faced down that devil. You can do this. Breathe with me. That is it. You are not alone. I am right here. He was her rock. He was the wall she pushed against. The sky was beginning to turn a faint, bruised gray when Sarah said, Now, child, now. You must push. One more time, for your family. Zoe gave a cry, a sound that was half agony, half fury, and she bore down, gripping Nathaniel's hands until her knuckles were white. The world seemed to stop. The wind held its breath. And then a tiny, thin, furious wail cut through the silence. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated life. It is a girl, Sarah said, her voice thick with fatigue and wonder. A perfect, healthy girl. She worked quickly, cutting the cord, cleaning the small, messy body, and wrapping it in the blanket Zoe had made, the blanket of snowflakes. She handed the small bundle to Zoe. Zoe was weeping, her body trembling, her face radiant. She looked at the tiny, red-faced creature, who was already quieting, her eyes squeezed shut. Oh, she breathed. Oh, Nathaniel. He was crying. The big silent rancher was crying, tears tracking silently down his rough cheeks. He did not wipe them away. He reached out, his massive, calloused finger, the one that could split logs and build doors, and he touched the baby's cheek. Amelia, Zoe whispered. Her name is Amelia. Amelia, he repeated. The name felt holy on his tongue. He looked at his daughter, wrapped in the blanket of healed wounds. He looked at his wife, who had traveled 2,000 miles, who had faced down her past, who had just fought a battle in the heart of a blizzard. He leaned down and kissed Zoe's damp forehead. He kissed his daughter. He looked at these two, his family, in the small cabin, in the heart of the winter. The world was still cold, but his home was warm. He leaned close to his new daughter, and he whispered the words that had become their creed, their history, and their future. You are not alone now, Amelia. You are not alone. The high, lonesome sound of the wind was still the voice of Montana, but it did not seem to howl as it once had. It seemed to sing, a low, steady song that moved through the tall pines and rustled the heavy heads of corn in the garden. 10 years had passed. 10 years since the blizzard. 10 years since the birth of their daughter. The cabin was no longer a small, stark box. It had grown. Nathaniel had added a full second room, with 2 proper bedrooms, and the porch, where he now sat, was wide and deep, its roof offering a solid shade. He rocked in a chair he had built, its runners worn smooth from a decade of use. He was not alone. He was never alone anymore. Zoe sat beside him in a matching rocker, her hands no longer thin and trembling, but capable and sure, busy with knitting. The simple gold band on her finger, a gift from Mr. Jenkins, was worn thin, but it was bright. The sun was a fiery smear over the western mountains. painting the peaks in shades of deep purple and rose. The air was cool, carrying the first clean scent of autumn. Down by the creek, which gurgled past the edge of their sprawling garden, came the sound of laughter, high and clear. "You cannot catch me, Thomas!" a girl's voice yelled, followed by a boy's indignant shout. "Amelia, that is not fair. You had a head start." A moment later, two figures burst from the tall grass, racing toward the porch. Amelia was 10, wiry and fast, with her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. Thomas, at 7, was built like his father, solid and stubborn, his hair the same dark brown as Zoe's. They tumbled onto the porch, a tangle of limbs and breathless laughter, before collapsing at their parents' feet.
"She cheated,"
Thomas announced, pointing a grubby finger at his sister. "I did not," Amelia said, her voice full of dignity. "I just anticipated the start." Zoe looked at Nathaniel, a small, secret smile passing between them. He reached out, his hand, now gnarled and marked by 10 more years of hard labor, and placed it over hers. She stopped knitting and turned her hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was a gesture as natural and as necessary as breathing. "She has your way with words," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. He looked at Amelia. "And you, Thomas, have your mother's stubbornness."
"Papa,"
Amelia said, ignoring her brother.
"Mr. Hendricks was here. He said the new schoolhouse roof is finished."
"I know," Nathaniel said. "I helped set the ridge beam this morning." "And Mama." Thomas piped up. "Mr. Jenkins's wife gave me a biscuit. She said to tell you the church fund ledger is ready for you, whenever you have the time."
Zoe smiled. "Thank you. Thomas, I will ride in tomorrow."
"Go wash," she said, nodding to the pump. "Supper is almost ready." The children scrambled up and ran, their bare feet pounding the boards, and the screen door slammed behind them. The sound echoed, a happy, domestic noise that had long ago replaced the silence. Zoe and Nathaniel sat for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. The first stars pricked the deep, velvet sky.
"Do you ever think of it?"
Zoe asked, her voice soft in the twilight.
"That first day at the depot?"
"I think of it," he said. "I think of the dust and the wind." He paused. "I was a fool. I did not bring the wagon. I was so lost in my own pride. I made you ride Bess when you were in such pain." "I do not remember the pain," she said, her voice honest. "I do not remember the ride. I remember what you said." "I was angry," he admitted. "I looked at your face, and I was angry." "I know," she said, squeezing his hand. "But it was the first time anyone had ever been angry for me. Everyone else, they were angry at me. For being a burden. For being a problem. You looked at me, and you did not see a problem. You saw a person." "I saw a fighter," he corrected her, his thumb brushing her ring. "I just did not know it yet." The past was another country. It rarely sent news. But the last, final letter had come, many years ago. Sheriff Blackwood, who now had a permanent limp from a cattle rustling dispute and who ate supper at their table every other Sunday, had brought it. It was not from Arthur. It was from the woman at the agency, the one who had given Zoe the ticket. It was a brief, concise note. Arthur Caldwell had died in a Boston debtor's prison. His schemes, his lies, his entire world of paper and deceit had crumbled to nothing. He had died alone, a ruined man. Zoe had read the letter twice. Nathaniel had watched her, his heart heavy, waiting for tears, or for anger, or for some kind of release. She had done none of those things. She had folded the letter. She had walked to the stove, lifted the iron lid, and dropped it into the flames. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. "It is done," she had said, her voice flat. and she had gone out to the garden to pick beans for supper, as if nothing at all had happened. The ghost, the shadow that had followed her for 2,000 miles, had finally been laid to rest. And the town, Silverdale, had become their anchor, the story of their arrival, which had started as a whispered scandal, had, over the years, been polished into a local legend. It was the story of the Reeds, the story of the quiet, decent rancher who had stared down a rich eastern bully and his hired guns, and had won. Not with a pistol, but with a marriage certificate and a wall of silent, stubborn neighbors. Zoe was no longer that poor mail-order bride. She was Mrs. Reed, the woman who had taught the town that justice could be quiet, the woman who kept the books for the church, the general store, and the new schoolhouse. She had found that her value was not something she needed to prove by working herself to the bone. Her value was in her mind, in her strength, and in the family she had built from nothing but terror and hope. She had not been rescued. She had, in the end, rescued herself. And Nathaniel, the loner, the man who had hidden from the world, was now the center of one. He was still a quiet man. He still preferred the sound of the wind to the chatter of the town, but the silence of his heart was filled. He had learned that to protect something, you did not have to own it. To love someone, you did not have to cage them. You just had to build them a door with a lock on the inside. His cabin, his home, was a place with an open door, a place that welcomed, not a place that imprisoned. The screen door creaked open. Amelia came out, holding a small blanket.
"Mama," she asked, "it is getting cold. Thomas is already asleep." "I know, sweet,"
Zoe said, pulling her daughter close. Amelia leaned against her mother's chair, but her eyes were on her father. "Papa, Mr. Jenkins told me a story." Zoe and Nathaniel exchanged a look. Jenkins's stories were legion.
"He said,"
Amelia continued, her voice serious,
"that when Mama first came here, she was very, very sad, and that someone had hurt her face."
The easy, comfortable quiet of the porch tightened. Zoe let go of Nathaniel's hand. She put her knitting aside. She looked at her daughter, at her clear, gray eyes.
"Yes, Amelia, that is true. I was very sad, and I was very afraid."
"But," Mr. Jenkins said, "you came with a letter, but that there was another letter, one that smelled like flowers. Is that true, Mama?" Zoe smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached her eyes.
"Mr. Jenkins sees far too much."
She reached into the pocket of her apron, the one she wore every day. From it, she pulled a small, folded piece of paper. It was brittle, the edges worn, and it was tied with a single faded lavender ribbon. Amelia's eyes went wide.
"You kept it."
"I kept it," Zoe said. She did not need to open it. She knew the words by heart. She held it out to her daughter. It was a letter of hope, from a time when I had very little. Amelia took it, her hands gentle, as if it were a holy thing. She held it to her nose.
"It still smells,"
she whispered, in awe. "It smells like the lavender you planted by the porch." "Yes," Zoe said, touching her daughter's hair. "I planted it, and it was hard to grow. The wind tried to take it. The storm washed it away. But we planted it again, and it was stubborn. And it grew." Amelia looked at the letter, this strange, fragile thing from a past she could not imagine. She looked at her strong, capable mother. She looked at her solid, quiet father. "You are not sad anymore, Mama," she said. It was a statement of fact.
"No, child,"
Zoe said.
"I am not."
"And you are not afraid?"
"No, I am not."
"Why?" Zoe looked up. She met Nathaniel's gaze over the top of their daughter's head. His eyes, in the deep twilight, were full of a love so steady and so profound it was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. He smiled at her. Zoe pulled her daughter into her arms, kissing the top of her head, She gave her the answer. The truth that had become the foundation of their home, their family, and their entire world.
Because,
Zoe whispered, her voice sure and strong in the growing dark.
we are not alone now.
Nathaniel put his arm around them both, pulling his wife and his daughter close. The night was cool, and the high, lonesome wind began to blow, moving down from the peaks. But it was just a song. It was the sound of home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like this video, and give it a boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.